smart people in the world. They seem to be breeding in record numbers. Now, all we can do as a family is stick together and remain vigilant.
Connaissance, recherche, sciences,
mathématiques,
théorie,
physique,
philosophie, conférences, archéologie, nature.
Je suis particulièrement heureux de vous accueillir tous, en regrettant, vous vous en doutez, que le Collège de France ne dispose pas de locaux suffisants pour accueillir encore davantage de monde. Je ne vais bien entendu pas faire à Noam Chomsky l'injure de le présenter. Je voudrais simplement le remercier d'avoir accepté l'invitation du Collège de France, et plus précisément, pour cette conférence, l'invitation de l'Assemblée des professeurs du Collège de France dans son ensemble. Même si cet aspect du problème semble avoir échappé assez largement à la presse, c'est cette initiative du Collège de France, et elle seule, qui est à l'origine de la possibilité que nous avons aujourd'hui, que nous avons ces jours-ci, de le revoir en France, après ce que je qualifierais de très longue et très regrettable absence. Le titre de la conférence qu'il va donner est Interpretation and Understanding, Language and Beyond, c'est-à-dire interprétation et compréhension, le langage et au-delà. Okay. Vous avez la parole.
For much of my life, I've been intrigued by several problems, one of which I've sometimes called Plato's problem, another Orwell's problem, and also by a third, which we might call Descartes' problem. Plato's problem was lucidly formulated by Bertrand Russell in his last major philosophical work. He asked, how comes it that human beings whose contacts with the world are brief and personal, are limited, are nevertheless able to know as much as they do know? And the roots of that go back to Plato. We can borrow some of the same words to formulate Orwell's complementary problem. How comes it that human beings with ample and reliable information at hand and nevertheless know and understand so little? Descartes' problem had to do with freedom of choice and action, unique to humans, so he argued, and what he called the noblest thing we have, illustrated most clearly for Descartes and his followers in what we may call the creative use of language, the capacities shared by all humans to freely express their thoughts in constantly novel ways over an infinite range, in a manner that's appropriate to circumstances but not caused by them. That's a crucial distinction. And that is also not causally determined by any extramental internal state. Humans may be incited or inclined to speak in certain ways by internal or external circumstances, but they are not compelled to do so, as his followers put the matter. For them, the dividing line between humans and what they call beast machines, animals or machines. They were describing the normal, everyday use of language. Later, Wilhelm von Humboldt called it the infinite use of finite means, a core element of the human creative impulse that should be nurtured by education in any decent society. He and other classical liberals argued. These are ideas that were developed further in Marx's early manuscripts and that have repeatedly animated popular movements. I discussed these three problems in memorial lectures for Bertrand Russell at Cambridge University 40 years ago. About Plato's problem, a good deal has been learned since, at least in a few domains. Plato, of course, had an answer to the problem, his theory of reminiscence from an earlier existence. Leibniz found Plato's thesis convincing when, as he put it, purged of the error of reminiscence, which to us must mean, when formulated in terms of genetic endowment, a topical that's at least in principle susceptible to study. Descartes' problem remains shrouded in mystery, perhaps permanent mystery, so Descartes conjectured, and we have no strong reason to believe otherwise. David Hume reached similar conclusions about the limits of human understanding. He was writing about the man he described as the greatest and rarest genius that ever arose for the ornament and instruction of the species, Isaac Newton. And about him, Hume concluded that his most memorable achievement was to draw the veil from some of the mysteries of nature, while at the same time restoring nature's ultimate secrets to that obscurity in which they ever did and ever will remain. Presumably it was with such thoughts in mind that Russell gave his last great philosophical work, from which I quoted, the title Human Knowledge, Its Scope and Limits. The title is appropriate if humans are part of the organic world, not angels, so that all human capacities have fixed scope and limits, the two intimately related. The inherent properties that provide their scope also determine their limits, an inescapable contingency. That's true whether we're considering athletic feats, intellectual and artistic achievements, or any other capacity, including the most ordinary and familiar, such as speaking our language. Newton had consigned nature's mysteries to permanent obscurity, Hume explained, by revealing the imperfections of the mechanical philosophy. Philosophy then, of course, meant science, so mechanical science. That's the conception of the world as a machine. That conception provided the criterion of intelligibility for Galileo and, in fact, all of early modern science, including Newton, who regarded his demolition of mechanical science as so great an absurdity that I believe no man who has in philosophical matters a competent faculty of thinking can ever fall into it, though he was compelled to accept that it is true, which was inconceivable to him, but nevertheless true. So by invoking the inconceivable notion of action at a distance, we concede that we do not understand the phenomena of the material world, where understanding is given a sharp meaning. It's construed in terms of intelligibility to the human mind with its own limits. The great scientists of the day shared Newton's judgment, sometimes with a degree of contempt. Christian Huygens, for example, described Newton's principle of attraction as an absurdity. Leibniz argued that Newton was reintroducing occult ideas similar to the sympathies and antipathies of the much ridiculed scholastic science, and that he was offering no physical explanations for phenomena of the material world. To these objections, Newton partially agreed, but only partially. His principles, he conceded, were occult, but not occult in the sense of the scholastics. The reason is that, as he put it, while the causes he postulated are occult, nevertheless, to derive general principles inductively from phenomena, and afterwards to tell us how the properties of actions of all corporeal things follow from these manifest principles, would be a very great step in philosophy, even though the causes of these principles were not yet discovered, yet because he hoped they might be discovered. But in fact, they never would be discovered in terms that Newton and other founders of modern science regarded as intelligible in accord with common sense understanding. So in that respect, Hume's statement that Newton left us with permanent mysteries appears to be correct. Thomas Kuhn, famous historian of science, suggests that Newton presumably wished to write a Principles of Philosophy like Descartes, meaning true science. But his inability to explain gravity forced him to restrict his subject to what he called the mathematical principles of natural philosophy, which did not even pretend to explain why the universe runs as it does, leaving the question in obscurity, permanent obscurity, Hume conjectured. Some of the ablest scientists of the 18th century continued to seek a mechanical, corpuscular explanation of gravity, that is, what they took to be a physical explanation, as indeed Newton did himself to the end of his life. In later years, positivists reproached all sides of the debate, quoting, for their foolishness in clothing the mathematical formalism of physical theory with the gay garment of a physical interpretation, a concept that had lost substantive meaning. That's Heinrich Hertz. As the impact of Newton's discoveries was slowly absorbed, science simply lowered its goals in a manner that's now so routine that it's unacknowledged. Scientists abandoned the animating idea of the early scientific revolution, namely that the world is in principle intelligible to us, and they restricted their goals to construction of theories that are intelligible. Now, that's a very significant step in intellectual history, by now so standard that it's not noticed. By the time we reach Bertrand Russell, his analysis of matter in 1927, he dismisses the very idea of an intelligible world as an absurdity, and in fact he repeatedly places the word intelligible in quotes to highlight the absurdity of the quest. Qualms about action at a distance, he writes, were little more than a prejudice. If the world consisted of billiard balls, it would be what we call intelligible. That is, it would not surprise us sufficiently so as to make us realize that we do not understand it. In this last phrase, Newton is invoking one of the great intellectual contributions of modern science, namely the ability to be surprised by what seems superficially obvious, and hence to recognize that we do not understand it. It's quite a difficult step to take. In fact, for 2,000 years, scientists were mostly satisfied that apples fall to the ground and steam rises to the heavens because they're seeking their natural place. It's only when Galileo and others were willing to be puzzled by the simplest phenomena of nature that modern science began. From a different perspective, when he moved from physics to psychology, Wolfgang Köhler observed that in psychology, it's far harder to make exciting discoveries. In physics, even the most elementary discoveries are exciting because they run so counter to common sense. For example, Galileo's demonstration, which in fact was by a thought experiment, like most of his experiments, his demonstration that rate of fall is independent of mass, contrary to what common sense would indicate. But in psychology, Köhler pointed out, discoveries seem routine, as if we always knew that, or at least we believed we did. Even far-reaching insights seem unsurprising, or to some incoherent. For example, the observation of Descartes that we can freely express our thoughts in novel ways without limit. So we speak effortlessly all the time, so what can be problematic? Some modern thinkers, like Wittgenstein, dismiss the very effort explanation of such matters as a childish error that should be overcome in favor of what he called compiling an assembly of particulars, just collecting data. Anything beyond that is a childish error. Similarly, how can there be anything puzzling about acquisition of language? After all, it's done routinely by infants, so it must be straightforward. And efforts to deal with it should appeal to nothing beyond pointing, ostension, and training. Those are Wittgenstein's two principles of language acquisition, or perhaps to conditioning, as W.V. Quine insisted. Some went on to invoke analogy and induction when paying attention, which is rare, to the truisms that were at the core of Cartesian philosophy, but these notions remained completely mystical and still do. Outside of narrow domains, such limits on curiosity have been standard practice for the 2,500 years of extensive study of language. They persisted almost without question into the 1950s. They're still largely prevalent today. And in such ways, inquiry into language and other mental processes was stifled at birth, much in the same way that the natural sciences were curtailed before puzzlement about simple phenomena became the norm in the early scientific revolution. Historians of science have recognized that Newton's reluctant intellectual moves set forth a new view of science in which the goal is not to seek ultimate explanations, but to find the best theoretical account we can of the phenomena of experience and experiment. These more limited goals were not entirely new. They have roots in an earlier scientific tradition that had abandoned the search for what were called the first springs of natural motions, their actual causes, and of other natural phenomena, keeping to the more modest effort to develop the best theoretical account that we can. This more modest project is what historian of philosophy Richard Popkin calls the constructive skepticism, formulated in detail by Mersenne and Gassendi, later by Hume, and what he called his mitigated skepticism. Skepticism because we can never be sure to know the answers, and mitigated because we could at least go some of the direction, some steps towards answering them. This mitigated skepticism, according to that, science proceeds by, still quoting Popkin, by doubting our abilities to find grounds for our knowledge while accepting and increasing the knowledge itself, and recognizing that the secrets of nature, of things in themselves, are forever hidden from us. That's the science without metaphysics, he says, which was to have a great history in more recent times. The goal is now sometimes called induction to the best explanation, but that remains a mysterious notion which has to be spelled out and explained somehow. It's an important topic of cognitive science in principle, not one that's been investigated, but in principle it is. It still remains at best at the margins of inquiry. Well, a curious feature of contemporary intellectual culture is that anti-foundationalism is regarded as a courageous battle cry. It's curious because foundationalism was almost entirely dismissed in the 17th century, and later, once Newton's discoveries made the transition from the absurdity that he believed them to be to scientific common sense, which is now sharply divorced from our common sense understanding. Well, Descartes, too, before Newton, had recognized the limits of cognitive reach. If you look at the Reguli, Rule 8 reads, "If in the course of subjects to be examined, we come to a subject of which our intellect cannot gain a good enough intuition, we must stop there, and we must not examine the other matters that follow, and must refrain from futile toil, from speculation based on nothing. Descartes speculated that the workings of the mind, of his res cogitans, might lie beyond human understanding. As he put it, we might not have intelligence enough to understand the workings of mind. But if the explanation for the normal use of language and other forms of free and coherent choice of action, if such explanation lies beyond our cognitive grasp, that should give no warrant for questioning the authenticity of our experience. He went on to say that there is nothing we comprehend more evidently and more perfectly than our ability to choose our course of thought and action, and it would be absurd to doubt that something that we comprehend intimately and experience within ourselves, and namely that the free actions of people are undetermined, it would be absurd to doubt that merely because it conflicts with something else which we know to be in its nature incomprehensible to us. Well, for Descartes, what was incomprehensible to us is divine preordination. For a tradition from Hume to Russell, it's the mysteries that lie beyond cognitive reach of this particular organism, ourselves, with its own scope and limits. That there are mysteries of this kind should be, again, the merest truism, assuming that we're part of nature. A separate matter, and an interesting one, is how these mysteries relate to questions that we might like to answer, or that we might like even to pose in proper terms. That's, in principle, a topic subject to empirical inquiry. So it might turn out that what we call science, human science, is a chance convergence between aspects of the truth of the world and our cognitive reach, biological property of humans. That's a conclusion that might be established, for example, by some differently organized alien intelligence, just as we can reach similar conclusions about insects. And there is, furthermore, no contradiction in supposing that even within the limits of our cognitive capacities, we might in principle discover a good deal about what these limits are. So, for example, within our cognitive limits, Newtonian science did provide evidence that intelligibility of the world is in a crucial sense beyond our cognitive grasp. And if it were someday shown that intelligibility of theoretical explanation for humans is restricted to determinacy and randomness, it might be possible to provide empirical justification for Cartesian speculations about our inability to comprehend what we know to be our noblest property, our capacity for free choice of coherent action, and in fact the core of our existence. One philosopher-scientist to have tried to address these problems seriously was David Hume, who's misleadingly described as the arch-empiricist. He was very far from that. Pursuing his mitigated skepticism, Hume recognized that much of animal and human knowledge must, as he put it, derive from the original hand of nature, which provides scope and limits to what can be attained. The original hand of nature is what we would call genetic endowment, and he argues that that provides the means for the experimental reasoning that guides scientific inquiry in some obscure fashion, and also the experimental reasoning on which the whole conduct of life depends. It can be nothing but a species of instinct or mechanical power, he said, that acts in us unknown to ourselves, and in its chief operations is not directed by any such relations or comparisons of ideas as are the proper objects of our intellectual faculties, In other words, whatever it is lies beyond our intellectual faculties. In our terms, rephrasing this, the genetic endowment and its cognitive manifestations lie far beyond the level of accessibility to consciousness. That's an idea, incidentally, which is dismissed as an absurdity by leading contemporary philosophers who regard themselves, curiously, as firmly within the modern scientific tradition. In reality, the doctrine of accessibility to consciousness is sheer dogma, borrowed uncritically from long-abandoned tradition and amply refuted by empirical evidence, but quite prevalent in contemporary philosophy. Hume's ideas were taken up in different terms by Charles Sanders Peirce a century ago. He's best known for other work, but in an essay which is barely known on what he called abduction, which long remained in obscurity, in that essay, Peirce faced Plato's problem squarely. It's unusual. He recognized that attaining theories requires some principle rooted in our nature, which, as he put it, puts a limit on admissible hypotheses, a very narrow limit, if the experimental reasoning and the whole conduct of life are to be feasible. Peirce could not spell out this principle of abduction, and there's been very little progress in doing so since, beyond quite specific domains. Peirce believed that whatever it is, this human capacity for abduction is a reliable guide to grasping the truth of the world. He gave an argument based on natural selection, which he said must have favored organisms capable of this achievement. But that surely is a fallacy. No selectional process made it possible for Galileo and his successors to be puzzled by what seemed obvious for 2,000 years and to construct theoretical explanations that may or may not approach the truth of the world, which we instinctively believe to exist, even by those who hotly deny it. We cannot avoid being naive realists, Russell observed, any more than we can keep ourselves from perceiving the moon illusion. The great figures of the 17th century speculated about the mysteries of nature in ways that have a resonance today, even though we don't use their terms. So Newton, for example, thought that some unknown force, which he called spirit, may be the cause of all movement in nature, including the power of moving our body by our thoughts and the same power in other living creatures, though how this is done and by what laws we do not know. We cannot say, he said, that all nature is not alive. Going beyond Newton, Locke concluded that we cannot say that matter does not think. As he put it in his theological framework, just as God had added inconceivable effects to motion, so he might have superadded to matter a faculty of thinking. But we cannot reject it on that grounds. He said it's true that this idea that God might have superadded, he might have created thinking matter, that's repugnant to the idea of senseless matter, but we cannot reject it on these grounds given our incurable ignorance and the limits of our cognitive capacities, what he called our ideas. So having no intelligible concept of matter or body or physical, we cannot dismiss the possibility of living or thinking matter, particularly after Newton had undermined common sense understanding. Well, Locke's repugnant idea of thinking matter was developed extensively through the 18th century, leading finally to the important work of scientist, philosopher Joseph Priestley, who, like Locke and others, recognized that the traditional mind-body problem had become unformulable with Newton's demolition of the only coherent notion of body or physical or material. So for Priestley and others, the only plausible conclusion, quoting him, was that properties termed mental reduce somehow to the organical structure of the brain. Similar conclusions were drawn from Hume to Darwin. Darwin asked rhetorically, why is thought, being a secretion of the brain, more wonderful than matter, than gravity, a property of matter? Today, curiously, it's widely held among philosophers that there's a crucial explanatory gap, as it's called, between the physical and consciousness. That is, a gap beyond the concerns for unification of science that arise throughout efforts to understand the world as somehow a more fundamental gap. However, unless the notion physical is given some new post-Newtonian sense, which has not been done or even attempted, unless that's done, there's even less reason to have qualms about an explanatory gap than in cases where there is some clear sense to the assumed reduction base. The most extreme of these concerns, and perhaps the most significant for the subsequent development of the sciences, is the explanatory gap that Newton unearthed and left unresolved, perhaps a permanent mystery for humans, as David Hume conjectured. Well, there are other curious aspects of contemporary debate about Plato's problem. Evidently, growth and development in any domain involve three factors: genetic endowment, external data, and laws of nature. For language, the first factor, genetic endowment, is sometimes called universal grammar, UG, in contemporary work. It's adapting a traditional term to a new usage. That UG exists can hardly be doubted. I mean, otherwise it would simply be a miracle that every child acquires language while its pet kitten or chimp or songbird or whatever, exposed to exactly the same data, it cannot even take the first step at determining which aspects of the data are related to language. That's no trivial task, incidentally, let alone all the rest. Nevertheless, a debate has raged over this matter for decades, a very odd debate, if only because it's one-sided. There are innumerable condemnations of what critics call the innateness hypothesis, apparently referring to the truism that UG exists. There are no defenders of the hypothesis, just as there are no defenders of the hypothesis that the mammalian visual system has a genetic component. The only serious question, as in the case of every other subsystem of the organism, is what are the properties of UG and how do they interact with other factors in growth and development. Another common objection is that little is known about the neural circuitry that's involved in the language faculty, either in its initial state before experience as determined by UG or in the mature state that it assumes. That too is rather odd. Little is known about far simpler questions. For example, the neurophysiology of the remarkable navigational capacities and communication systems of insects. But that's never been considered a reason to question the research that seeks to determine their properties abstractly, properties which, as in the case of language, provide a kind of a guide to inquiry into what Priestley called the organical structure of the brain that underlies these properties. One prominent cognitive neuroscientist, C.R. Gallistel, has an important recent book in which he argues that throughout the long history of inquiry, neurophysiologists, psychologists, computational linguists, and philosophers have been looking in the wrong place. they've been studying associative bonds and synaptic conductance, and that, he writes, cannot encode facts about the state of the experienced world, memory storage, or the stable systems that are called upon in performance. Instead, he says, they've got to throw out the whole traditional enterprise, begin again, start looking for elementary units of computation with the properties that enter into any kind of computational system, units that have the property of read, write, and address, elementary properties of any computational system, and these, he argues, are quite appropriate to the tasks at hand, even for insects, and very likely for humans too, but are not the things that neurophysiologists are looking for. They're just looking in the wrong place. The science has to be completely reconstructed if he's correct, which he may be. Descartes' problem is beyond human inquiry, perhaps forever. We can at least try to discover the mechanisms that are used in free choice of action, including his prime example, creative use of language. That is, we can try to discover the finite means that enter into infinite use in Humboldt's formula. By the mid-20th century, the general mathematical theory of such mechanisms was quite well understood, and it can be adapted to language, where by language here I mean an internal system, a subsystem that interacts with other systems in the life of the organism, what biologists sometimes call modules or organs. Each language must be based on a finitely specified computational procedure that generates an infinite range of hierarchically structured expressions that provide instructions for two language external systems, the sensory motor system, which we use to make the noises that we hear and produce, and the systems of thought and action. So putting it in different terms, the computational procedure provides information for the phonetic interface and the semantic pragmatic interface, all parts of our body. In that way, the language will satisfy the conditions formulated by Aristotle, who described language as sound with meaning. Actually, recent work suggests that the formulation should be changed, that language is meaning with sound. That's a significant difference. According to that view, externalization of language by the sensory motor system is a secondary process, both from an evolutionary perspective and the perspective of the structural design of the system. I can't go into details here, but the basic thrust of the argument is fairly straightforward. The internal computational procedure is sometimes called a generative grammar, or more perspicuously, an internal language. It's incorporated somehow in any such procedure is an operation, call it merge, that takes two objects already generated and forms from them a new object. The simplest operation will leave the two objects unchanged and unordered, so we can take the new object to be just the set of the other two. Reapplying merge over and over again, we obtain an infinity of hierarchically structured expressions. Furthermore, if no special stipulations are added, merge will form structures with what are called displaced elements. So, for example, if merge is applied to the structure underlying John saw what, it will form what John saw what. And if we carry out merge again, it can form guess what John saw what. That structure is then transferred to the two interfaces. Well, it turns out to be just what is required for the semantic pragmatic interface, where the element what has two functions. It's the direct object of the word see, and it gets its semantic interpretation from that, and it's an operator ranging over the whole expression which means something like, guess for which thing X John saw the thing X. The X is interpreted twice. That's the right information for the semantic pragmatic interpretation, but it's completely the wrong information for the phonetic interface. So we do not say, guess what John saw what. Rather, we say, guess what John saw. We delete the second occurrence of John, the lower occurrence in a hierarchy. Only the most hierarchically prominent occurrence remains in externalization. The others are all deleted. And in more complex expressions, that means lots of deletion. Well, that makes sense from the point of view of efficiency of computation and articulation. They are greatly simplified by this procedure. However, it raises problems for communication. It's necessary for the hearer to determine what's missing and where it is. And that becomes an extremely complex problem, as anyone knows who's worked on automatic parsing programs or on perceptual models. Well, what this illustrates is that there's a conflict between computational efficiency and communicative efficiency. And in this and every similar case of conflict that's known, language design favors computational efficiency and sacrifices communicative efficiency. In other words, considerations of computational efficiency yield the right results at the semantic pragmatic interface for thought and action, but they harm communication. Well, that's an important conclusion. And in fact, the outcome is exactly what we would expect on evolutionary grounds. So merge is in fact clearly a universal property of the human mind brain today, but our early ancestors lacked that property. Hence, at some point in the past, not the very remote past, some mutation must have taken place, perhaps very slight, which rewired the brain to yield this capacity, to yield this operation, merge. Well, mutations take place in an individual, not in a group. And the person who underwent this mutation could exploit existing conceptual capacities to think, to interpret, to plan over an unbounded range. The person had what's sometimes called a language of thought. Well, that presumably confers a selectional advantage. In part, it would be inherited by offspring. Sometime later, the property would be shared by enough people in a small breeding group, and we come from very small groups, maybe a few thousand individuals. The property could take over a small group. At that point, if enough people have the capacity, it would be advantageous to externalize the inner thought. To do so, it's necessary to solve a hard cognitive problem, that is, to relate the internal generative system, which had emerged suddenly, to the sensory motor system, which had been around for hundreds of thousands of years. We know that from fossil evidence. So we would expect then that this secondary system, this secondary component of language, the externalization, would be complex, varied, subject to historical change, and so on. And that's indeed what we find overwhelmingly. The fact is very familiar from language acquisition. To learn a second language, one has to acquire the vocabulary, which is an arbitrary linkage of sound and meaning. You have to acquire inflectional systems. You have to learn about linear order, and so on. But no one can learn the syntactic or semantic rules, or for that matter, even the meanings of words in their normal, rich complexity, because evidence for that is virtually non-existent. In many cases, totally non-existent. And no one can teach any of this, since our knowledge of them is beyond the reach of consciousness. And what theoretical understanding has been attained is surely not put to use in language acquisition. Notice that an unbounded generative procedure is an all or nothing affair. You either have it or you don't have it. There are no intermediate stages. Well, it's commonly argued, in fact almost universally, that there must have been preliminary stages. It's sometimes called proto-language. There's no empirical evidence that any such stages ever existed, and there's no conceptual reason to suppose that they did. If they did exist by some chance, they were irrelevant. It's just as hard to move from 7 to unbounded as from 1 to unbounded. So in the absence of empirical evidence or conceptual justification, a normal scientific practice would lead us to assume that there are no intermediate stages. That virtual truism seems problematic or even outlandish to almost all researchers, another curiosity. They're accustomed to think of evolution as a series of gradual steps, which it certainly is not. No serious biologist can believe that. But it's a kind of what's sometimes called pop Darwinism, popular version of Darwinism, totally not evolutionary theory, but standardly believed, even by some scientists, amazingly. The truism is often condemned as catastrophism, based on vague ideas like mutation. But those objections are entirely without merit. They actually come from scientists. The catastrophism is a conceptual necessity. There's no way to go from finite to infinite except by what's called catastrophism. You can't go in small steps. And it's not in the least inconsistent with evolutionary theory, within which, of course, mutation is a core principle. Well, notice that design considerations and evolutionary considerations converge. They yield the same conclusion, that language is designed for computational efficiency, yielding a language of thought, but it's not very good for communication. It's inefficient for communication. The conclusion was expressed lucidly by Nobel laureate François Jacob. He observed that the role of language as a communication system between individuals would have come about only secondarily, as linguists believe, I think he's referring to me. The quality of language that makes it unique does not seem to be so much its role in communicating directives for action or other features of animal communication, but rather its role in symbolizing, in evoking cognitive images, in molding our notion of reality, and yielding our capacity for thought and planning through its unique property of allowing infinite combinations of symbols and therefore mental creation of possible worlds. Those, I think, are accurate ideas which actually trace back to the 17th century cognitive revolution and have been richly elaborated in the past half century. Well, that seems surprising to a lot of people, virtually everyone who works in the field, but it's pretty straightforward, and I assume sooner or later will be understood to be pretty close to truism. Well, to summarize so far, Plato's problem falls within those parts of biology that at least we know how to study. And in some domains, including language, there has been real progress in recent years. Though Descartes' problem remains beyond reach, there has been considerable progress in, see if I can find what I'm talking about. There has been considerable progress in at least discovering the mechanisms that enter into the infinite use of the finite means, the problem that plays such a central role in Cartesian thought, and yield some consequences that depart quite sharply from common assumptions, like the ones I've mentioned. Well, let me turn finally to Orwell's problem. Illustrations abound. Even giving examples is misleading because they're everywhere, they're ubiquitous. And they give a good deal of insight into the prevailing intellectual cultures. And it's not hard to identify the means that have been developed by systems of power to ensure that people will know and understand little despite the wealth of information available to them. Well, again, I can only give scattered illustrations, and they're inevitably misleading because they may appear to be exceptional, although in fact the practices are ubiquitous. So take just one case, a recent and illuminating one, the NATO bombing of Serbia. It was the subject of an inquiry by prestigious specialists in international law, led by the eminent South African jurist Richard Goldstone. The panel determined that the bombing was, in their phrase, illegal but legitimate. The illegality was transparent. It was a flagrant violation of the UN Charter, the foundation of modern international law. In fact, it was an example of what the Nuremberg Tribunal determined to be the supreme international crime, differing from other war crimes because it encompasses all the evil that follows. That was the crime for which the Nazis were hanged at Nuremberg. And this is it's a kind of a test example, a standard example of it. Nevertheless, the panel found this war crime to be legitimate because, as they put it, there was no other way to stop the killings and atrocities in Kosovo. It should be noted that this is a standard interpretation in the West. It's a Western interpretation, accepted almost without exception in the West. The non-aligned countries, which represent the majority of the world, bitterly rejected it, condemned the bombing and what they called the so-called right of humanitarian intervention on which it was based. They regarded it as just more of the posturing of Western imperialism with its civilizing missions and other familiar affectations of benevolence. More revealing than that is the question of fact, which is actually uncontroversial in this case. To reach its conclusion that there was no other way to stop the killings and atrocities in Kosovo, the panel had to reverse the chronology and to reject the unanimous conclusions of a mass of impeccable Western studies, including 2 detailed State Department reviews and reports of NATO, the OECD, the Western monitors on the ground, and others. The evidence reveals unambiguously that the killings and atrocities were overwhelmingly the consequence of the bombing, not the cause, and in fact its anticipated consequence. NATO, the commanding general, Wesley Clark, he informed the press as the bombing began that atrocities on the ground were predictable. He had already briefed the White House with the same prediction. Actually, the facts are revealed as well in the indictment of Milosevic, which was issued right in the midst of the bombing. The charges, if you look, are all post-bombing, with one exception, which we know meant absolutely nothing to the attackers, because at that very moment they were supporting comparable atrocities carried out by their allies in cases where the past record was far more grotesque than anything that had happened in the Balkans. And furthermore, they continued to support those atrocities well after the bombing of Serbia ended. Well, this is only a fraction of the story. What's relevant here is that the fallacious conclusion of the Goldstone panel is almost universally accepted in Western intellectual culture, in complete disregard of the unusually rich documentary record. There could hardly be a clearer illustration of Orwell's problem. And as history and familiarity with cultural norms would suggest, a rational discussion of this matter is virtually impossible in the West. Any mention of these uncontroversial facts elicits the most impressive tantrums. And that's understandable. The period before the bombing was marked by one of the most extraordinary episodes of self-glorification in intellectual history. Can't think of anything like it. Prominent figures in the West lauded themselves and their own states for acting on principles and values for the first time in history, as the attackers led the enlightened states to a new era of history, acting out of pure altruism in a noble phase of their foreign policy with a saintly glow and so on, in a deluge that would have impressed Kim Il-sung. And after that performance, recognition of the elementary facts of the matter would be a psychological impossibility for the educated classes. And they have therefore resorted to what comes naturally to them, familiar means of to protect themselves from exposure and unwanted facts, slanders, lies, hysteria, denunciation, all of them virtually unanswerable, given the near monopoly of control over expression. In this case, it even includes the dissident fringes in the mainstream, which had been in the lead, if you look back, and trumpeting their own magnificence and supporting the attack. Now, there's a great deal in print about all this, but it's irrelevant. It's far too inconsistent with doctrinal orthodoxy and with self-protection to enter awareness. Well, the example is perhaps unusual in its clarity, but apart from that, it's pretty close to the norm. The mechanisms that are adopted to implement Orwell's problem are also not obscure. I mean, on the contrary, they've been described frankly and with approval by the leading practitioners and the most respected ones. Well, in brief, by World War I, elite circles in the West, primarily England and the United States, the more free societies, elite circles were coming to understand that popular struggles had achieved so much success that the population could no longer be easily controlled by force, and it would therefore be necessary to control attitudes and beliefs. Among other devices, a huge industry was created to fulfill this task. It's called the public relations industry, primarily a U.S., secondarily British invention, later taken over elsewhere. There's an early industry manual by one of its leading figures, Edward Bernays. It opens by observing that the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. But clearly it is the intelligent minorities which need to make use of propaganda continuously and systematically, because only they understand the mental processes and the social patterns of the masses and are therefore in a position to pull the wires which control the public mind, which they can regiment every bit as much as an army regiments the bodies of its soldiers. This process of what he called engineering consent is the very essence of the democratic process. Bernays wrote 20 years later, when he was being honored by the American Psychological Association in 1949 for the quite impressive achievements that he had made. Bernays was not on the right wing. He was a good Roosevelt liberal, Wilson, Roosevelt, Kennedy liberal. In fact, he had honed his skills in Woodrow Wilson's Committee on Public Information. The name should give it away. It's the first U.S. state propaganda agency. The committee was the official component of a campaign in which the most respected liberal intellectuals undertook, in their words, to serve as the faithful and helpful interpreters of what seems to be one of the greatest enterprises ever undertaken by an American president. They were referring to Woodrow Wilson's decision to enter the European war right after he was elected on the promise of peace without victory, not entering the war. So that was one of the greatest enterprises ever undertaken by a president, and the liberal intellectuals had to serve in that cause. Unwittingly, they were serving as instruments of the British Ministry of Information, which secretly defined its task as to direct the thoughts of most of the world, but particularly the thoughts of American intellectuals. The British recognized that that would be necessary to bring the United States into the war. The targets of British propaganda, namely the liberal American intellectuals, they were adopting good Wilsonian doctrine. Wilson's own view was that an elite of gentlemen with elevated ideals is necessary to preserve stability and righteousness. It's the intelligent minority of responsible men who must control decision-making. Another veteran of the Committee on Public Information explained in his quite influential progressive essays on democracy in the same years, as they were called. That's Walter Lippmann, the leading American public intellectual of the 20th century, also a Wilson-Roosevelt liberal. This specialized class of public men is responsible for the formation of a sound public opinion, I'm quoting Lippmann, as well as for setting policy. The public must be put in its place. Its function in a democracy is to be spectators of action, not participants. It may act, but only by aligning itself as the partisan of someone in a position to act executively in periodic exercises called elections. That's the liberal end of intellectual thought. And the liberal academic world agreed. Harold Lasswell, one of the founders of modern political science, also liberal intellectual, he explained that the intelligent few must recognize the ignorance and stupidity of the masses who have to be controlled for their own good. Well, I've been sampling only from the progressive end of the spectrum. Views become harsher as we move towards the so-called conservative or reactionary end. And others were impressed by the success of these enterprises to control the public mind. Nazi propaganda, for example, consciously based itself on American commercial advertising with unfortunate success. The Bolsheviks tried to do so as well, but much more clumsily. It was never particularly successful. The basic principles remain. They take various forms, although, of course, they're constantly denied with rhetorical flights about dedication to democracy. Well, unlike the other two problems, Plato's and Descartes', Orwell's problem is quite easily solved at the intellectual level, but the solution to the problem explains why it remains with little impact within the dominant intellectual and moral culture that leaves obvious tasks for those who do not accept the guiding principles. Thanks.
Connaissance, recherche, science, mathématiques, théorie, physique, philosophie, conférence, archéologie, nature.
Je remercie Noam Chomsky chaleureusement pour sa conférence. Nous pouvons consacrer, je pense, à peu près une demi-heure à la discussion, peut-être un peu plus, mais tout de même pas beaucoup plus pour ne pas abuser des forces et de la bonne volonté de notre conférencier. Et autant que possible, il serait souhaitable que les questions soient posées en anglais. Est-ce que quelqu'un demande la parole? Oui, Stanislas Dehaene.
this is a question on I'm here. Stand down. This is a question concerning your position on universal grammar, and whether you believe that this is a system which is unique to language. You spoke about a module for language, or whether you might consider that this is in fact a system, and maybe the merge operation, which lies at the core of it, would be an operation which is in fact non-modular and shared perhaps with the ability to perform mathematics, to perform music, and to plan action quite outside of the domain of language. So what is your position on the modularity of the modularity of the merge operation? Is it unique to language, or is it shared with mathematics and music and action?
And music. Well, that's an interesting question. Actually, it's a question that was raised by Alfred Russel Wallace, the co-founder of evolutionary theory, along with Darwin. He has, in his major work on evolution of humans, he asks the question, how could it be that humans all have mathematical capacities? He said it couldn't have arisen through natural selection because these capacities were never used. In fact, only very recently have been used at all, and then by a very narrow sector of the population. So they couldn't have been selected, so how come they're there? Well, he speculated that there must be some other principle beyond natural selection. A kind of a more reasonable speculation is that they're an offshoot of things that did develop, and the obvious choice is natural language. And in fact, there are ways, simple ways, to derive basic arithmetic from the human language system by radical restriction of the operations. In fact, if you restrict the lexicon, the vocabulary, to a single item, you essentially get arithmetic. Well, that proposal there have been objections to that proposal in the psychological literature on the grounds of what's called double dissociation. So you find people who have the language capacity but have lost the numerical capacity, and conversely. However, as the person sitting next to you has pointed out, Luigi Rizzi, that doesn't tell you anything, because those dissociations have to do with performance. You also find dissociations between reading and knowledge of language, but nobody believes that reading somehow developed independently of language. So if you want to study these questions, you have to begin by making the crucial conceptual distinction between the internal system and the means of putting it to use. And you can get deficiencies in the means of putting it to use that don't tell you anything about the internal system. So I think it stands as a reasonable idea that mathematics, at least arithmetic, is just an offshoot of natural language. And there was no problem of natural selection. It's just there once you have natural language. Now let me stress that's arithmetic. What about the rest of mathematics? Well, there's a famous comment by the mathematician Kronecker that God created the natural numbers and humans created everything else. If we reformulate that, it could be that the evolution of the human language capacity created the natural numbers, and everything else is created the same way science is created. Whatever capacity it is that we use to make sense out of the world is used to create, in fact, to consciously create the rest of mathematics. And the rest of mathematics is, in fact, empirical in a certain sense. So while there's a certain necessity to the truths of arithmetic, and in fact, even that's not quite accurate, like there are what are called non-standard models of arithmetic, but putting that aside, arithmetic is more or less, it's kind of like logic. It doesn't allow a lot of options. On the other hand, set theory is based on just stipulations. You have to stipulate the axioms, and you can have the set theory with one and not the other. So it's kind of an empirical subject. In fact, Kurt Gödel famously, great mathematician, argued that arithmetic is the only fixed system of pure thought, pure analyticity, absolute truth, and that set theory is an empirical subject, and you pick your axioms in such a way as to derive the phenomena, which are the truths of arithmetic, in the best way, much as you pick your physical theory to account for phenomena like motion of the planets. So that could be the answer. Well, what about music? Music is found, I think, in all cultures, but it's found in a lot of different forms. So the traditional Western genre is just one kind of music, and there have been some investigations of how it might relate to the language faculty, has some similar properties. But what's found all over is rhythm, and a lot of musical traditions are really just based on rhythm. And rhythm is probably deeply rooted in just the way the brain functions, at least the human brain, apparently not other brains. But there is work that appears to, especially work by Lauriane Petito, a cognitive neuroscientist, that appears to show that there's a part of the brain which you can identify by imaging techniques that responds to a particular rhythmic structure, which happens to be, the periodicity of it happens to be about the length of 2 syllables. And this shows up in human infants as early as you can detect it, so it's probably prenatal. And it's somehow responding maybe to some language like prosody, and that's the basis of rhythm, and it could be that rhythmic traditions somehow develop out of this. I think these are research topics. It's a very good question. Why do they exist? It's Wallace's question. Why do they exist since they can't have been selected?
Although I quite agree that we have much to gain going beyond what lies beyond language, I would suggest maybe the move which turns back to what lies at the core of language. And the reason for that is the following one. Languages are certainly not sciences. However, they contain successive layers or chunks of knowledge, sensory-built knowledge, and to that extent, they can make us able to interpret in the framework of Hume's intelligibility of the universe what takes place in front of us. This is to be related with what you mentioned as the ability to be surprised, I would say even to be flabbergasted at times, flabbergasted, to be surprised or even flabbergasted by what so far seems to be obvious. This might probably be related with the inadequacy of language, of words, but they can be reformed. And there are many steps in the history of many languages, of language reforms, during which the inadequacy of words has been superseded or replaced with new words which were, by the fact, adequate to what had to be expressed or what to be meant. So I would suggest taking advantage of what you refer to as phonetic interface and semantic pragmatic interface, and also to what you referred to as the fact that there is a small minority of gifted personalities who must control, as you seem to suggest, the evolution of society. I think that they do so with a tool which happens to be language itself. Language itself. Mm-hmm. So in fact, although I quite agree that we might gain much from an investigation which looks for what lies behind it or beyond it, I think there is also good reason, and this dovetails nicely with the first process. There is no contradiction between them. We also have much to gain from a process which goes back to the very core of language as built by societies and reflecting what you very nicely refer to as property of symbolizing, of building cognitive images. I quite agree. This means that we have to exploit the core of language, and not only to try to go beyond it.
Well, I'm not sure I completely understand, but what we, if I grasp, tell me if I'm wrong, what we call language intuitively is a conglomeration of many different systems. So what I've been talking about is some core system which is basically built into us, and it yields the Cartesian capacity. And it includes lexical items which come out of nobody knows where, but they're basic conceptual atoms which apparently are universal and are quite complex, and they're available somehow before language, both from an evolutionary point of view and an acquisition point of view. And those are the items that are used in the kind of thought processes that every child picks up reflexively. Now, there are other things in what we call language that are conscious inventions. So when you move on, say, to the sciences or to mathematics and so on, you invent concepts all the time. Eigenvalue, phoneme, all kinds of things. And those concepts are very much unlike the concepts that are our native concepts. For one crucial difference is that those concepts, those that are invented consciously by the scientists, neutron, phoneme, and so on, those concepts are at least intended to have a reference. They're intended to pick something out in the world, something real. So if scientists invent the notion, say, neutron, they would like to believe that there's some extramental entity that in fact corresponds one-to-one to this notion that they've developed. Similarly, when say linguists invent the notion, say, phoneme, they would like to believe that somewhere in the world there's actually an entity that corresponds to the phonemes. That's completely different from the concepts that we pick up just reflexively. So there is nothing in the world that corresponds to our concept person or river or tree or city or any other one that you pick up. They just don't have reference. They have completely different properties, whatever properties nature devised. We have no choice over that. And they're universal, so they're understood the same way in every language, independently of data. And to mix them up with the consciously created technical vocabulary, I think is an error. It's a conceptual error. I mean, we call them all language, but they're quite different. A lot of philosophical debate really goes off track here, I think. For example, those of you who know modern philosophy are aware that there's a huge debate over the sentence, water is H2O. And out of this come various thought experiments about twin Earth and so on and so forth. Well, there's some problems with that. I mean, a sentence has meaning only in a language. What language is the sentence, water is H2O, in? It's not in English, because English doesn't have the notion H2O. It's not in chemistry, because chemistry doesn't have the notion water. I mean, of course, chemists use it, but they don't mean what we mean by it any more than by, say, energy or work. They mean the intuitive notion. So, in fact, there's no language in which water is H2O is a sentence. Therefore, it can't have any meaning. Therefore, there can't be any discussion about it. And your intuitions about it don't matter. I mean, all of the philosophical literature is based on your intuitions about this formal object about which you have no intuitions and can't have them because they're not in any language that you acquired. And that's, I think, a striking example of something that's much broader, actually, which was kind of at the core of Wittgenstein's work. Wittgenstein argued that, I think he kind of overdid it, but he argued that philosophical problems come from a failure, a misunderstanding of language, in part the belief that technical terms are handled like ordinary terms. In fact, he said the meaning of the term is just the way it's used. There's no And for scientific or technical terms, well, the usage is stipulated. It's not for the rest of language. And his argument was that if you could sort of do kind of psychoanalysis on philosophers and lead them out of their misinterpretations of language, you probably eliminate philosophy. That was his goal in his later work. There's something to it, I think, and I think things like this are a good example. And what you're describing is certainly correct, but I think it's a kind of a heterogeneous notion of language which brings together many different aspects of a human cognitive activity, which we loosely call language, but they're not going to be the same as the internal language, which is the genetically determined structure that's kind of at the core of all of this. They bring together a lot more.
Yeah, I want to ask a question about, on the one hand, language, and the other hand, communication. You seem to suggest that the function of language is not essentially for communication. In fact, it's badly designed for communication. It's designed for other purposes. But when we think about humans in small groups, and most of the time, when we think about humans in small groups, hunter-gatherers, for example, and most of the time we've been in small groups as hunter-gatherers. Perhaps we don't know very much about what they were like back then, but we do know, perhaps on the basis of examination of hunter-gatherer groups now, that they communicated a lot. They gossiped, for example, and gossip appears to be quite important. And you can think about the central role that communication has in group solidarity and bringing the group together, and group planning. That is, groups plan together by communicating, to go out and hunt or to gather. So communication seems to be a central feature of the activities of these small groups. And if you think about it in a kind of, I suppose, naive way, you can well imagine that it has enormous evolutionary value. One would think that communication is really important here, evolutionarily. But you seem to suggest that no, language did not come about for that purpose. It came about for other purposes. And I'd like to ask you to say a little bit more about communication, which does seem so important when we talk about groups of human beings, and the mother-child interaction. Take another example that seems to be important.
What was the second?
The mother-child interaction,
Mother-child
which is based upon, again, communication, and that seems to be set in very early on with the use of language.
Yeah, well, we ought to begin. First of all, it doesn't really matter whether it seems intuitive or not. Most things that we discover about the world are counterintuitive, as has been known since Newton. But is it intuitive? First of all, what do we mean by communication? I mean, if we understand communication broadly enough so as to include every social interaction, then, of course, the communication is part of the use of language. But if we mean by communication something like, say, transmitting information or anything more or less definite, then communication, first of all, is not specific to language. We communicate in all sorts of other ways, like we transmit information about ourselves by style of dress, for example. In fact, by just about everything we do. So naturally, we do it by language. But also, a great deal of the usage of language in the most primitive hunter-gatherer tribes is not for communication in this sense. So people sit around the fire telling stories, let's say, or they establish social relations among themselves. And we all know that. I mean, there are few things that are more embarrassing than being placed into a room with somebody who you have nothing to say to. And it's kind of threatening. You can't not talk to them because that's too threatening. And you can't talk to them because you have nothing to say. So it's extremely uncomfortable. So what you do is try to, I don't know, talk about the soccer game or something. But there's just kind of a necessity to interact somehow. And language is one of the ways we interact, but gaze is another one. How far you stand from someone is another one. In fact, there are cultural differences on this. And naturally, language is enters into those things too, but it's not communication. Actually, it's what Malinowski called phatic communication, meaning not communication, but just establishing human relations. And a great deal of language, even in the smallest groups, is like this. And in fact, if you just introspect, almost all the use of language is internal. It's thought. You can't go for a minute without talking to yourself. It takes a tremendous act of will not to talk to yourself. How you're talking to yourself is an interesting question. It hasn't been investigated. In fact, it's a re-internalization of what's externalized, interestingly. You're not talking to yourself in the language of thought. You're talking to yourself in whatever your native language is. So you can tell when you're thinking if two of your sentences rhyme, let's say, which means that you're using the most external aspects of it, and you're re-internalizing it, and that's probably 99% of the use of language, which has nothing to do with communication. And an interesting question is, well, how does that re-internalization relate to actual thought, which is far beyond the capacity for introspection? It's not accessible to consciousness. It's going on somewhere, but we can't access it. Maybe there's some other ways to access it beyond introspection, but they haven't been discovered yet. However, I don't think that there's, if you make any relatively specific characters, if you offer any relatively specific characterization of communication, I think what we find is that communication is a pretty marginal use of language, even in the smallest, most primitive groups, in families and so on. So it's used, of course, for communication, but it doesn't seem to be well designed for it, and that doesn't seem to matter. I mean, there are plenty of properties of language that just harm communication, but those are aspects of language you don't use. You avoid them in some fashion. But the very design of language seems not to be based on communication, and you'd expect that on evolutionary grounds for the reasons I mentioned. So it's true, it's counterintuitive. I mean, it's just like it's kind of a cliche that language is designed for communication. It just happens to be wrong, I think.
I would like to ask you a very simple question, in fact. I'm a little bit surprised that after so many years of work, so many results, the status of generative grammar is still questioned. Do you think it could be related to the oral problem? What I mean is, do you think, in fact, the ideas of generative grammar could, in fact, be in contradiction, in an abstract way, perhaps, with what we could call Orwell's ideas?
You mean?
Yes.
Could be. My suspicion is that the reason these pretty elementary ideas are considered controversial is probably related to this question, the preceding question. There are some things that just seem obvious, like it's obvious that language is for communication. It's obvious that children acquire a language. Not going to be a problem. It's obvious that we keep talking without thinking about it, so how can anything be going on in our heads? Essentially Curler's observation. It's just hard to accept the concept that there's something surprising and difficult about it. Just as for thousands of years it was hard to accept the idea that there's some problem about stones falling and steam rising. It's pretty hard to break through that barrier, and particularly hard to do it when it's something about ourselves. So sort of intuitively we kind of think we understand it all. I can't think of any other reason, but it's a fact that the study of language is just suffused by extreme irrationality. In some cases, like the study of the evolution of language, I mean, the whole field is kind of off the planet, you know. I mean, even its existence is irrational. Literally, I mean, think about it. Evolution of language is going to be an extremely hard problem. There are much simpler problems that are not studied, like evolution of communication system of bees. Bees are much easier to study than humans, you know. Tiny organisms, brain the size of a grass seed, do any experiment you like. 500 species, they all differ a little, say a lot of comparative evidence. Some of them have no communication systems at all, and they do about as well as the ones with the complex systems. Interesting question what it's all for. So there's a kind of like an ideal topic for study. Take a look at the literature. There's almost nothing on evolution of bee communication because biologists recognize it's just too hard to study. Okay? On the other hand, human language is incomparably more difficult. There's libraries full of books on it, conferences, articles in newspapers, and so on. It's just totally irrational. And if you look further, it becomes even more irrational. So if you look at those libraries of books on evolution of language, you'll notice most of the work that's in them is study of animal communication systems. Well, what does that have to do with evolution of language? Probably nothing at all. Communication systems of animals are different from human language in just about every respect we can think of. So probably it tells you nothing at all. It's kind of fun to read about the weird, strange things animals do, but it doesn't tell you anything. When you get to the speculations about how human language evolved, they have quite a striking property. They're based on total ignorance of the nature of language. They're based on the fact that humans use language to communicate. I mean, that's about like saying that it's as if somebody proposed a theory of the evolution of the eye, the human eye, based on no knowledge at all of what the eye is, and knowing only that humans watch television. You know? I mean, you couldn't get away with that in a serious discipline. But almost everything in evolution of language is exactly like that. No question about what is the thing that evolved. Just let's make up a story about how it got there from, grooming or dance or something else. It's extremely irrational. And this kind of an aura of irrationality around it, which is pretty far-reaching. And I suspect it's just because it is something so essential to our nature that we find it hard to believe that there's anything surprising about it.
Hello? No, just it's by curiosity. I'm here. Yeah. I'd like to have your specific point of view, maybe with Fitch and Hauser too, about the recent research on molecular biology on the FOXP2 genes, and I'd like to have your point of view about the implication about your linguistic generative theory, the implication of the FOXP2 genes. No?
What's the implication of the FOXP2 gene?
Yes.
FOXP2?
Yeah.
You don't care, or?
Yeah, it's an interesting. It's not very clear that it has all that much to do with language. FOXP2 is found in all kinds of fine motor coordination and things like that. It is related to certain language disorders and so on. So maybe it means something, maybe not.
But you don't have any point of view yet, so.
I don't have anything to say about it. But it's.
Thank you.
There's literature on it, and I think it leaves the status of the question. But maybe somebody here knows more than I do and can say something. But what I've read about it seems to suggest that the FOXP2 gene. First of all, it's found in organisms all over the place, and it's involved in lots of different kinds of activities, like fine motor coordination. And the idea that you're going to find a gene for language is very strange. That's just not the way genetics works. I mean, genes do all kind of different things depending on which kind of configurations they're in, what master genes control them, and so on. I mean, a gene's just producing a protein, and it can be doing it in it can be doing it in different ways in the same organism at different stages of development.
Yes, hello.
You cannot escape the question of the genetics of a universal grammar of language. Not talking about genes, but if you're right, I mean, you have to find the mechanisms, the genetic mechanisms that allow language.
To find a mechanism, surely, but we also want to find a mechanism for insect navigation. Yeah, okay, so, and the question is where to look. For insect navigation, nobody knows where to look.
For example, the way you define language, there is no language in monkeys, there is language in the human species, right? So we have to find what the difference is. Why?
Well, you know, look, it's a little bit like saying that there's human navigation and bee navigation, and we have to find out what the difference is. It's not a sensible question. There's no reason to think there's any relation between them. I mean, bees do dead reckoning. We don't. Okay, so that's a difference. To find the neural basis for that it's beyond today's science. And you can only investigate it if you learn something about each of the cases. So if you learn about each of the cases, so if you want to compare, say, how I get home at night with how a bee gets back to the nest, you're going to first have to learn something about how I get home at night, and separately how a bee gets back to the hive, and then you can see if there's anything related. There's no particular reason to expect much. And in the case of what we call animal language, that's just a metaphor. It's like bee navigation.
I'm not talking about animal language, but you're saying that the universal grammar, UG, is some of innate or genetics, could be specific to the human. I believe that very strongly, but you still have to explain it, because the question of the ladybird fox P2 could be not the type of question we like, but in any way, if it is innate, we have to understand this phenomenon at the genetic level at some point.
At some point, we hope to study it, to be able to say something about it at the genetic level, at the neurophysiological level, and so on. And we'd like to say something about the evolution, too.
It has appeared at some point also. It has also appeared during evolution at some point. Something like appeared, emerged, appeared.
Okay. What? Period? Yeah.
Well,
language has
appeared at a certain point.
Something like 120,000 years ago, something has happened that allows us to have a language.
That's perfectly
true.
So
this you cannot escape.
And these are extremely hard problems. They're way beyond the problems that science can reach, even for much simpler organisms. See, I think that's another example of the irrationality that surrounds the study of language. People expect to find answers for language that you can't find for insects. It just doesn't make sense to have those expectations. The problems that, say, Gallistel is talking about, can we find the basic neurophysiology of the most elementary computations that insects carry out? Well, so far there's no progress in that. He argues neurophysiologists are just looking in the wrong place. There'll never be progress. They have to start looking somewhere else. But whether that's right or not, the fact is that essentially nothing is known about it. The study of the neurophysiology of human language is incomparably more complex. So sure, we're going to have to wait a long time before we can find out about that. And apart from the fact of being intrinsically more complex, we also can't carry out intrusive experimentation. So there are things you can do with insects to get answers that you just can't do with humans because you're not allowed to. We know about a lot about human vision, but the reason is because we allow ourselves, rightly or wrongly, to torture cats and monkeys, and we figure they have about the same visual system we do. So therefore we know something about human vision. But in the case of language, there's no other animal to torture. And nobody has any of these properties. So there's essentially no comparative evidence, and there's no invasive techniques that are permissible. And the problem itself, even if we had all of this, would be far more complex than questions that nobody knows how to answer because they're just too hard. Science works at the limits of understanding. It doesn't go way beyond the limits of understanding. It tries to explore the limits of understanding and push them a little farther. And you can think of all kinds of questions that are way beyond the limits of understanding in every field, but you can't investigate them. And questions like these are among them. So yes, it's a goal, it's something to search for and try to find something about, but it's not very significant if you can't get any answers, since you can't get answers even to far simpler questions, like, say, neurophysiology of bee navigation or bee communication.
Hello, I'm here. Over there. Okay. First of all, could you elaborate on what you call design? What exactly is design? Design? Design, yes. Yeah. What is it you call design? And the second question is, you often talk about democratic societies, and for you, do we live in a democratic society or not?
I didn't get the last part.
Do we live in a democracy or do we not live in a democracy?
Are we in a democratic society?
Yeah.
It's not really a yes or no question. I mean, democracy has many dimensions. In some respects, we have a more or less democratic society. In other respects, not at all. We have formal elections. Okay, that's property of a democratic society. On the other hand, the capacity to enter into those elections is either as a candidate or as someone who supports a candidate is that capacity is distributed very unequally through the society. I mean, some can do it, others can't. Sometimes it's, say, in an American election, you can only participate in an election if you have a core of campaign funding which is based where capital is, namely in the corporate sector, which is willing to pour money into your campaign. Electoral campaigns you can virtually predict the outcome of the campaign simply by looking at campaign spending. And that means people who can't amass corporate contributions can't enter the process. And so if you like, you can say that candidates are vetted by the corporate system, and those who pass their filter can enter into it. Kind of the way in Iran, clerics, the candidates are vetted by the clerical hierarchy, and those who they don't accept can't participate. All right, with us, it's the corporate system that carries out the vetting. We have the right of free expression up to a point. That's an aspect of democracy. It's lacking elsewhere. In countries like the United States, and Europe is not far behind, it's going in the same direction, electoral campaigns are just extravaganzas, like circuses. The campaign managers purposely keep away from issues. In fact, they say so. They keep to what they call qualities. You want to make sure, because you don't want issues to arise in elections. One of the reasons is that campaign managers read polls, of course, and they know that on issues the public generally opposes both parties by large majorities. So you want to keep away from issues. And if you look at the study, there are a lot of this is one of the main topics in political science, so there's plenty of data about it. but it turns out that voters have almost no idea where the candidates stand on issues. So, for example, that's not because they're stupid, it's because it's hard to find out. The campaigns are designed so that you don't know. What you're supposed to know in a campaign is that, you know, George Bush is the kind of guy you'd like to have a drink with. You know, nice guy, you know. He's an ordinary guy who wants to go back to the ranch and, you know, cut brush and run a marathon in 100 degrees heat and have a beer with and so on. But you don't want to know where he stands on issues, if he even knows where he stands on issues, which often they don't, you know. Because, well, it's a kind of democracy, but a very limited kind. In fact, there are countries where there is really functioning democracy. We don't talk about them very much. But take, say, the Western Hemisphere. In 2004 and 2005, there were elections in the richest country in the hemisphere, the United States, and the poorest country in South America, namely Bolivia. And they were radically different. In the United States, the two candidates were Kerry and Bush. They both come from great wealth. They both went to the same elite university, Yale University, where they both joined the same secret society, Skull and Bone Society, which is there to train promising young men and turn them into future political elite. They ran on pretty much the same programs, and the population didn't know what their programs were for the most part. They were able to run because they were supported pretty much by the same concentrations of capital. And the election was kind of like throwing a coin. You know, it comes out more or less randomly. Well, that's the election in the richest country in the hemisphere, the leader of the free world. They go to Bolivia, the poorest country in South America. Well, Bolivia really had a remarkable election. The indigenous population, which is the most repressed population in the hemisphere and happens to be the majority in Bolivia, they had been involved in very significant popular campaigns for some years. So in the year 2000, for example, they had organized to drive major multinationals out of Libya, including a French one, because they were trying to privatize water. The privatization of water, according to economists and the World Bank, is highly efficient. It has a slight deficiency. Most people can't afford the water, but, well, nothing's perfect, you know. But so they mobilized and they drove the corporations out of the country. And there were a lot of other things going on. They finally got to 2005. There was an election. They got well enough organized so that they were able to enter the political arena and elect someone from their own ranks on issues that they all knew about, important issues like control over resources and cultural rights in a very complex mixture of cultures, question of justice and so on, and they were committed to it. Furthermore, the election was just one day in a continuous popular struggle, and not like the United States, where it's a day where you go to the poll, push a button, and forget about it. Okay, well, which country was democratic? I mean, according to everything that's written, the United States is the world leader of democracy, and nobody talks about Bolivia as the world leader in democracy. But on those two occasions, it was quite the opposite. And I think there are many such examples. It's just too multidimensional a question to have a simple answer.
What about design?
Design?
Yes.
Yeah, I probably shouldn't use the word because it misleads people. Design doesn't mean that there's a designer, of course. It just means whatever the structure of the system is. So, you know, you could talk about the design of the helium molecule, let's say. That's the same way in which you talk about design of language. How is it constructed? What's its nature? There ought to be some better word for that that doesn't lead to misleading connotations.
Dernière question, peut-être, si possible.
Oui, je voudrais I'm sorry, I just wanted to ask you, since the other person talked about democracy, Me too. I would like to refer to the last part of your speech about democracy and the fact that it's important that the population know about everything. But my question is about state reason and pragmatism. State reason and pragmatism. That's what we say, raison d'etat in French. And the other question is about the lobbying and its effect, negative effects, I can say, in United States of America's government. Thank you.
I'm afraid I didn't hear. Did you hear?
Lobbying, the effect of lobbying in the United States, and pragmatism. The link between pragmatism and state reason, raison d'etat.
Well, there are major lobbies in the United States, and they have a big effect on legislation and so on. By far, the biggest ones are the business lobbies. I mean, they just overwhelm everything else. So the Chamber of Commerce, the Business Roundtable, the American Petroleum Institute, the insurance companies. I mean, they have huge lobbies, and they spend huge amounts of money, and they pretty much shape legislation and by the congressmen. Those aren't the lobbies that people talk about, but they're the ones that really make a huge difference. There are lots of other lobbies. So there are ethnic lobbies, for example, and sometimes they have an effect. So take, say, the Armenian lobby. It's a small lobby, but it has effects, in fact, sometimes big effects. So just recently, in fact, the Armenian lobby almost caused quite severe problems for the U.S. government in its relations with Turkey by passing a resolution characterizing the Armenian genocide as genocide. Well, Washington doesn't do that because that's going to harm relations with one of its major allies. And they managed to deflect it at the last minute. But it's a lobby that's quite small, but had an effect. The biggest ethnic lobby, and the one that gets all the attention, is the Israel lobby, which is real, and it has some effects. But if you look over the record, the idea that the Israel lobby somehow determines U.S. government policy is, my friend Gilbert Ashkar, a Middle East specialist, described it as phantasmagoric, that idea. I mean, the relations of power are such that the Israel lobby could not possibly control American policy. In fact, if the business world didn't like U.S. support for Israel, they'd put the Israel lobby out of business in 2 minutes. But they happen to support what Israel's doing, so okay, therefore the lobby can have an effect. And there are plenty of, if you want to study this topic, there's a lot of literature on this topic, but it's not thought through very carefully. There's no use looking at cases where the lobby and Washington have essentially the same interests. It doesn't tell you anything. There's no point looking at cases where Washington just doesn't care and the lobby has an interest. Okay, that doesn't tell you anything. You have to look at the cases where they have opposing interests and then see which prevails. And there are plenty of such cases. And invariably, the lobby disappears. They know they cannot confront government power. Now, that's true on all sorts of things. So just to take one example, Israel happens to have its economy is kind of a high-tech economy based quite significantly on military industry, and they need a market. And there's a huge market out there called China. So they'd love to sell high-tech military equipment to China, but Washington doesn't want them to do it. And every time they try to do it, they get smashed down. In the Bush administration, which is supposed to be very pro-Israel, the last Bush administration, in 2005, Israel wanted to sell upgraded anti-aircraft missiles of some kind to China. The Bush administration said you can't do it. They insisted that we're a sovereign country, we're going to do whatever we want, nobody can push us around, at which point Washington simply humiliated them. It told them, you're not going to do it. Furthermore, you have to apologize to us formally. And furthermore, we're not going to allow any of your representatives to come to Washington until you do it. Okay, they did it. What did the lobby do? They were hiding in the corridors. They don't want to confront U.S. power. They know more about the power system than that. And that happens on many things. It's happening right now. It's pretty clear. The Israel lobby has repeatedly tried to set up a confrontation between the United States and Iran. So, in fact, during the last presidential campaign, sensitive moment, the lobby tried to push through Congress a resolution calling for a blockade of Iran. Okay, a blockade's an act of war, could lead to unpredictable directions. And they got a lot of people to sign on. A lot of people in Congress signed on. All of a sudden, it stopped. Well, we don't know exactly why, but it's almost certain that it stopped because they got a signal from the White House saying, we don't want Israel to get us into a war with Iran. So it stopped, and that was the end of that. And there are plenty of other cases. Actually, some of the cases are pretty narrow, but quite interesting. Like Israel's plans for the occupied territories. One of the core elements of the plan is to develop a corridor that bisects the West Bank, breaks it in two parts. The corridor will expand from what's called Jerusalem, which is some huge area way bigger than Jerusalem, all settled in violation of Security Council orders. So a corridor that goes from there to the east, going through a town called Ma'ale Adumim. The town was established by Yitzhak Rabin in the 70s and then developed mostly in the 90s under the Oslo Agreement with the purpose of bisecting the West Bank. But in order to complete it, they have to construct in a corridor. It's called the E1 corridor that goes from Greater Jerusalem to Ma'ale Adumim. They have to build there. And they very much want to do it because they want to finish this construction. The U.S. said you can't do it. So they're not doing it. The relations of power are such that they simply have to do what they're told. And the lobby doesn't get involved when it's going to run into real power, which is what you'd expect. So there are lobbies, but there are limits, and the big lobbies are far and away the business lobbies. And they're the ones who really run the country.
Dernière question, brève si possible. Oui, je vous en prie.
Yes, I'm wondering if you could comment about the Orwellian question that you spent a good amount of time discussing in relation to specifically the question of the acceptance of Israel in the OECD this week, and perhaps on the basis of what they call like-mindedness amongst the members of the OECD. And I'm wondering if you could comment about that in relation to the Operation Cast Lead of last year, and now what happened during the day today, if you have any comments about that.
So what about Operation Cast Lead and what
happened this morning, which was off the coast of in international water, the attack of the flotilla?
Well, what happened this morning, we don't know enough to... I think it's very embarrassing to the United States, and they'll try to find some way to get around it. Operation Cast Lead is very straightforward. The U.S. supported it throughout, absolutely supported it. So did Obama. In fact, Operation Cast Lead was very carefully timed. It was very carefully planned. It was very carefully timed. It was timed to end hours before Obama took office. Now, there's a reason for that. That allowed him to pretend that he can't say anything about it. His line was, there's only one president, I can't say anything about it, which of course is nonsense. He was saying things about all sorts of other topics. It's his way of saying, yeah, I approve of it, but I don't want to say anything about it. It was timed to end just when he came into office so he could say, well, let's talk about the future. History is history, we'll forget it, let's talk about the bright future that awaits us. But basically the attack was carried out with the explicit approval of the United States, with U.S. arms. The U.S. intervened at the United Nations to prevent anything that might stop it. So it was a U.S.-Israeli invasion, explicitly, as are all of Israel's military activities. That example, too, illustrates very well Orwell's problem, just as strongly as the example that I gave. In fact, I was thinking of giving that example. It's almost universally accepted in the West that Israel had a right to attack, but that the attack became disproportionate. So if you look at the human rights reports, Goldstone report, and so on, they don't question Israel's right to attack. That's supposed to be the right of self-defense. But they do question whether they went too far. Okay, so that's what the whole discussion is about. Did they have a right to attack? Well, both international and customary law, domestic law, are quite explicit about this. You do not have the right to use force in any event, personal, international, whatever, unless you've exhausted peaceful means. Well, had they exhausted peaceful means? No, they hadn't tried them. And they hadn't tried them because they were pretty confident that they'd work. There had been a ceasefire, and during the ceasefire, there wasn't a single Hamas rocket. You can read that on the Israeli government official website. Okay, Israel broke the ceasefire in November by invading Gaza, killing half a dozen militants. There were then some rocket firing in both directions. All Palestinians are the only ones who were killed. Hamas offered to reinstate the ceasefire. That offer stood right up to the day of the invasion. It was considered by the Israeli cabinet, and they rejected it. And we know that from internal Israeli sources. So it's the U.S. and Israel. They knew that they had peaceful means to eliminate rocket fire. They chose not to use them. Accordingly, the attack had absolutely no justification. But try to find a sentence in the Western press saying this. Well, you can't. That's an example of, if you can find one, I'd like to see it. I don't read everything, of course, but I haven't been able to find any sentence in the Anglo-American press. It's just taken for granted. They had a right to attack because the U.S. says so. In fact, they had no right to attack. It's a war crime. They didn't have a right to fire a single bullet. The problem isn't the disproportionality. As long as the U.S. supports what Israel does, that's the way it's treated in the West. That's why they're allowed into the OECD, because the U.S. supports them. I mean, that's just the servility of European powers. They do what the master wants.
Bien, je crois que nous allons être obligés de nous arrêter. Il me reste à remercier chaleureusement, au nom du Collège de France et en votre nom à tous, Noam Chomsky, d'abord pour sa conférence et ensuite pour cette discussion passionnante que nous aurions certainement aimé pouvoir continuer indéfiniment, lui aussi peut-être, je ne sais pas, mais malheureusement il faut que nous arrêtions. Donc je le remercie et j'espère que nous n'aurons pas à attendre à nouveau une trentaine d'années pour le revoir en France. Merci.
Connaissance, recherche, sciences, mathématiques, théorie, physique, philosophie, conférences, archéologie, nature.
Bien, je pense qu'à partir de cet exposé, il y a
Well, I think that
de
based
nombreuses questions,
on this,
réflexions.
probably going to have a great number of questions and thoughts from
Vous avez
the
la
floor.
The partial failure of corporates, liberal-based corporates, and to some extent also other representatives of economic power, triggered as they are by what you call power hunger, to increase their power as much as they wish to, might be explained to some extent, I hope not explained away, by the reaction, even if a still weak one, of those who suffer in communities and what you call victims, those who do not accept and agree less and less with this situation. So my query is the following one. To what extent couldn't the very notion of economic rationality or economic orthodoxy be redefined, taking into account the tremendous groundswell of awareness, of political awareness of all those individuals, including countries, nations, and other kinds of Hegel-defined types of human communities, who might someday deny the very internal logic of economic oppression, of economic power, and to that extent try to put into question the fact which we all attend, assist, we all witness today, to wit that the wealth of the mightiest increases while their own poverty also increases.
So who might be the agents of overcoming this, the power of economic rationality or the next religious doctrine that comes along? Same as always, popular movements. Popular movements to which educated people can contribute if they want to withdraw from their vocation. Their vocation is to be the intelligent minority who holds the club and keeps the population subdued. That's the traditional vocation of intellectuals, back as far as you want to go in history, pretty much across the spectrum. But there are people who separate themselves from it. Russell and Orwell are two of them. And if they join with rising popular movements, they can help them articulate their goals, work with them, and so on. But the main force has to come from the public, the way it always has. And it can succeed. I mean, it's not a record of gloom. So, for example, the Western countries are far more civilized than they were, say, 50 years ago or 70 years ago, in many respects. And it's important. Topics like this, for example, almost could not be discussed not many years ago. In the United States, not at all, but even in Europe, not very much. The intellectual climate was, Stalinist or liberal democratic. All right, now you can talk about them. And you can talk about them anywhere. I don't know about France, but in the United States, you can talk about them anywhere. Working people, farmers, students, and so on. They may not, the concepts may be new to them, but the perception is not foreign to them. And as I said, it goes right back to the origins of the Industrial Revolution in the United States. And the same is true in many other dimensions. Like, take, say, women's rights. It's totally different from what it was 50 years ago. So, for example, my own university, main technological university in the world, when I got there in the 1950s, it was everyone, you walked down the halls, you saw white men, well-dressed, obedient, deferential, period, practically nothing else. You walk down the halls now, it's half women, third minorities, casual dress, which is not just symbolism. I mean, it means social relations have changed, not reflexive obedience. A lot of activism on all sorts of topics, nothing like that 50 years ago. And the same is true all over the country, and I think in Europe as well. Okay, those are changes. there's far more opposition to aggression now than there was, say, in the 1960s. It's pretty common for people to ask, why wasn't there the kind of opposition to the Iraq War that there was during the Vietnam War? Well, actually, for those of you who are old enough to remember, there's much more opposition to the Iraq War. You go back to the Vietnam War, at any point at all comparable to the invasion of Iraq, there was practically no opposition. In fact, there was strong support for it. We couldn't run public demonstrations because they'd be broken up by violence, by students, with the liberal press applauding. There's nothing like that in the case of Iraq. And in fact, that had an inhibiting effect. The U.S. was never able to do anything like what the liberal Democrats could do in the 60s. Okay, it's not enough, but it's important. In the 1960s, there was no concern, virtually no concern, over environmental damage, which was very severe. Okay, now it's a major mass movement. Governments and corporations have to work hard to prevent it from instituting the kinds of changes that might actually save the species from destruction. Well, then there was nothing. Okay, these are changes. They didn't come as a gift from the rich and the powerful. They didn't come from political leaders. They came from popular activism, just like everything before them. And that's the only, there's not going to be any other magic tricks, I don't think.
Professor Chomsky, first of all, we've been waiting for you here in Paris for so many years, so thank you for being here, and thank you to the Collège de France for organizing this beautiful journey through ideas and reflection. So I have one factual question. As you may know, here in Europe, we are going through a serious crisis, and let's say through a series of serious crises. Do you think that the Eurozone was a mistake due to the fact that it was built on economic purpose rather than a strong social construction?
Well, actually, the economic plans that are being used in Europe are a social program. And like most social programs, they're in favor of somebody and against someone else. Just like Martin Wolf said, he's a conservative economist. They're against the populations and in favor of the banks. Okay, and that's a social program. I mean, you can like it or dislike it, but on pure economic grounds, it's very questionable. You know, not a lot is understood about the economy, but one thing that is understood is the lesson of Keynes. If there's low demand and business isn't investing, the only way of creating it is through government expenditure. I mean, if you're in a recession, you should have a deficit. That's the way to grow out of a recession. You should have a deficit. You have stimulus, government stimulus, gets people back to work. It's good for them. It's good for the economy, and ultimately you pay off the deficit. Now, there could be a threat of inflation, but that's not a threat in Europe. Inflation is extremely low. I think it's about 1% now, or something like that, in the Eurozone, which is nothing. But inflation is bad for bankers. They don't like inflation. So they want to cut that back, and if it means slowing down growth and making the population suffer, well, okay, we'll follow that social program. But it is a social program. We shouldn't have any doubt about that. People like Martin Wolf are quite correct. And there are alternatives. You know, massive stimulation, government stimulation of the economy, for example. And for a country like Greece, there's a very obvious alternative, and that is to default, to simply refuse to pay its debt. The debt it's what's called an odious debt. It has no legitimacy. The debt was not borrowed by the population. They didn't ask for that money. It was borrowed by the tiny sector of wealth, which doesn't pay their taxes and is still very wealthy. They're not suffering. So they borrowed the money, so then, okay, let them pay it back or let the banks suffer. You know, that's what you would do in a capitalist system. But the way it's being done here, which is radically anti-capitalist, is that the poor people in Greece who never benefited from it, they have to pay it off. And people here have to pay it off through the IMF and the Eurozone. Well, okay, that's a social program. It's not an economic program. And there's good reason to believe that it would work. In fact, there are recent models. There's a recent model in the U.S. zone, Argentina. Argentina followed all the orthodox policies of the International Monetary Fund. For a while, it looked pretty good, but it was built on sand, so it collapsed, and they went into deep depression, 20% unemployment and so on. Well, they disregarded all the rules. They defaulted. They restructured their loans against the advice of the profession, the IMF, everyone, the Treasury Department, and they had a huge growth rate. They grew themselves out of depression. They essentially did the same as cutting off the euro. They broke the connection between their currency and the dollar, which would be the same as Greece getting out of the eurozone. And they were then able to carry out monetary policies which enabled them to grow and develop in violation of economic orthodoxy, but with enormous success. And that's been recommended by a number of quite serious economists, but it doesn't enter into the public discussion much because it's not good for the bankers and the financial institutions and the lenders. In fact, it's quite a remarkable property of the bailouts in the United States and Europe in the last period. They don't impose any cost on the lenders, virtually no cost on the lenders. What's called a haircut in economic lingo. Barely impose that. But that's what ought to be done. I mean, if people make bad loans, okay, it's their problem. In a capitalist system again, but not here.
Yeah, I want to try to clarify what you say, because on the one hand you speak of progress, you mentioned that now, but of progress, the progress. You mentioned that there is progress in, in your university, etc. But you also mentioned that there's been this stagnating wages and so on, and this increased financiation of the economy. So I would like to clarify these two pictures, you see. At one point, I think recently, you have said in an interview with Baillargeon that there have never been so many anarchists and so little anarchism now. And you also said in another interview that one is not supposed to say anything good about the communists, which we have seen again today, but nevertheless in the 30s, they were the one who organized the popular movement and built up the CIO and made actually the New Deal possible. So would you like to comment on the fact that if there's been progress on the front of the anti-racist, anti-sexist, etc. struggles, there's been an immense regression on what used to be the main focus of the old left, namely class struggle and distribution of wealth and so on. Yeah. And so, especially on the sentence that you said there have never been so many anarchists and so little anarchism.
That's about the United States now. I can't talk about other countries, but yeah, that's quite true. But we should remember that the protest in the 1930s became strong about 6 years after the Depression. Depression was in 1929. That's when it hit. And it was much worse than what's happening today. I mean, today it's bad, but that was incomparably worse. And it took quite a few years before it developed. And then, yes, it was class-based. So the union movement had been virtually destroyed in the 1920s by Woodrow Wilson, and then in the 1920s it almost disappeared. But it reconstituted in the 1930s, and it became quite powerful. And by the mid-30s it was reaching the point of sit-down strikes. And that really frightened the capitalist class. A sit-down strike is just one step before taking over the factory and saying goodbye, bosses. And that's when the New Deal measures came along. And business was concerned. It's a very class-conscious business class in the United States. You read the business literature in the late 30s, they're talking about, I'm quoting, the hazard facing industrialists in the rising political power of the masses and the need to fight the everlasting battle for the minds of men to save us from disaster. They were really frightened. All right, that's not happening now. There was another, for one thing, the labor movement has again been pretty much destroyed, like it was in the 1920s, and it's not reconstituting. I mean, it's too bad, but it's not happening. The other thing is that there's something missing that we're not supposed to talk about, but it's worth remembering. Somebody mentioned it, maybe you. There was a Communist Party then. Now, there were all kinds of things wrong with the Communist Party. You know, when I was 10 years old, I was already condemning it for Spain. But there was one thing right about it. It was always there. You know, there were people there who didn't expect to win in 2 weeks. It's not, we're going to sit in the office of the president of the university for 2 weeks and then there'll be peace and love. It wasn't that mood, which you remember from '68. It was, we're in it for the long haul. There are going to be defeats. We'll learn from them. We'll go on. There's always somebody around to turn the mimeograph machine. There's a memory of how to do things. You don't have to start over again every time. You know, you don't have to learn how to organize a demonstration. And they were in the forefront of everything. Labor organizing, civil rights, women's rights, everything. So with all the flaws, you know, they were there. I mean, I can remember it from my own relatives, you know, when I was a child, mostly unemployed Jewish working class, right around the fringes of the Communist Party, many of them. And as far as they were concerned, the whole relation to Russia was just ritual. Like you said it because you're supposed to say it, but they didn't care one way or another about Russia. What they cared about is, you know, my aunts who were unemployed seamstresses cared that they could get a week in the countryside at, you know, one of the Communist Party run social groups. There was workers' education. As somebody quoted Lancelot Hogben, I forgot who. He was a Communist Party intellectual who was involved in working class education, like a lot of quite famous scientists, Bernal, others. But it was always there, you know, and that's missing. There's no common core. So there's a lot of activism, but it's very scattered. And it's scattered on it's doing the right kind of things, but it's doing the sorts of things that alienate a large part of the population. So if there's a group focusing, say, on gay rights, it's good that they're doing it, but you have to remember that for white working class males, that's threatening. And same with the other kinds of, if you're working for illegal immigrants, you should be doing it. But white working class Americans are living under an illusion that the rich liberals who own everything and don't care about them are giving everything away to illegal immigrants and blacks and welfare mothers. And that's the reality you have to face. And that's not being faced by the left movements. The Tea Party movements tend to be ridiculed. And there's a lot that's ridiculous. But the people have real grievances. And you can't just ridicule them. Maybe the leadership, yeah, you can ridicule. You can make fun of Sarah Palin. But the people who they're appealing to are people whose lives have been harmed for 30 years. They don't understand why. You know, you listen to talk radio, and the standard stance of people who call in is, you know, I've done everything right. I'm a white working class man. I'm a devoted Christian. I believe in God. I've served in the army. I mean, I've done everything I'm supposed to do. Why is my life collapsing? You know, why is my country being given away from me? Why are all my values being trampled on, and so on? And why can't I get a job when the bankers have money coming out of their ears? Well, those are authentic complaints. Yeah, maybe they're phrased wrongly, but they're real. And you can't just ridicule them. These are the people who ought to be organized by the left, and that's not happening. And unfortunately, there are unpleasant analogies. It has something of the flavor of the Weimar Republic. Take a look back. There's similar demography, similar concerns, and we know what happened. You know, could happen. I don't say it's likely to, but unless there is an organized activist left which really becomes engaged in addressing the people who have authentic concerns, it could be unpleasant.
Attendez, on va essayer d'organiser un petit peu les choses. Il y a monsieur là-bas, il y a madame Cheng ensuite, et puis madame là, qui demande la parole depuis longtemps.
May I make two questions only? The first one is the solution that you propose has had, we have historical experiences of it, I mean the control and management. But they have always been for local situations. Do you think that this could be upscaled for the whole society in a very extrapolative way, or do you think that we have to impose certain design specifications and structure or constraints on that sort of situations? The second question is related. I would like to know your judgment or opinion concerning what is there any relation between the experiment that you were describing in your talk and the theories, major theories in political philosophy, like Rawlsian and their critics?
I didn't understand very well. Jean, could you understand what he said? Did you hear? I don't hear very well. Did anybody? What? Power?
Distributive justice theories.
What? Theory of justice? Oh, Rawls. Yeah, I see. Okay, thank you. So, it's not your fault. I don't hear very well. So about Rawls' theory of justice? I mean, Rawls was actually a personal friend, and I think his work is very good. And I like it. I don't really think it applies very well to the real problems that are arising. It's interesting in a kind of an abstract way to try to derive principles of justice from pretty abstract considerations. But when he tried himself to apply it to real situations, it became a recipe for liberal democracy, internationalism, the kind of things that many of us would think are fine, but they don't really follow from the theory, and there's no real basis for them that I can see. And he didn't try to address the complex reality of social and economic life, the power system and how it works. So, for example, you can't study the United States without recognizing that there is a very class-conscious, unusually class-conscious, very powerful business community, always fighting a bitter class war, never relentless, and unusually powerful. That's one of the reasons for the difference between the United States and Europe. And you just can't study the United States without paying attention to that. They have overwhelming power over the political system. They basically frame what happens in the media. Without just even introducing that factor, you're just not discussing the country. So it doesn't matter what the abstract theories say. And there are other things like that. I mean, there are other things about the United States which really have to be considered seriously. It's a very frightened country, and always has been. Back to colonial days. There's some good scholarship on this. But there's a reason why people didn't laugh when Reagan strapped on his cowboy boots and said, we're under threat from Nicaragua, from Grenada, Saddam Hussein, whoever. It's a frightened country, and always has been. And you've got to pay attention to that, as a cultural fact. And there are other basic things that have to be considered if you want to talk seriously about the country. And Rawls, it just wasn't his interest. I mean, he was sympathetic, he's a decent liberal, but it's not his concern, and the theory doesn't try to reach questions like that. So I don't see, it's kind of intellectually interesting, but I don't see much we can do with it. Actually, I'm personally interested in it because you may not, he kind of played it down after a lot of criticism, but the model that he used was a linguistic model, very explicitly. There was so much criticism from philosophers who hated it that he withdrew it, but its recent work is bringing it back, and that was not uninteresting. He was actually following ideas that David Hume expressed, and that are sort of in Kant, more or less, that there has to be some instinctual base for our moral judgments. And he thought he could use models of language to be suggestive about how to construct a theory of the instinctual base from which people can draw indefinitely many moral judgments in new situations. That's a reasonable framework, and there's actually interesting work going on about it, but it doesn't begin to reach problems of human concern. That's hard. I mean, even in the hard sciences, it wasn't until pretty recently that they had much to say to engineers and doctors and so on. It's a hard job.
Professor Chomsky, Francis Feely from University of Grenoble. I'd like to pursue this question of fear, the role of fear, particularly in mobilizing social movements. I've been teaching in France for many years and also in the United States. And you see people who have been teaching here for decades can see an evolution or devolution in the students on campus. In the courses, there is a real fear, and it is translated into self-censorship, lack of interest, apathy, and a keen interest in money. Money is freedom. To have 45 euros in your pocket makes you free, right? And the world of ideas and the free exchange with people you don't know very well, but talking about important issues has dwindled to almost nothing. In the classroom and outside of the classroom, less. What I'm wondering is what do you, in that context of a pervasive fear in society where everyone is reduced to sort of individual survival tactics, what is the role of the intellectual in making a contribution to a serious social movement, in your opinion?
Well, I don't want to talk about France. I don't know it well enough. But in the United States, what you describe is very real, and there's a basis for it. Let's go back to the crisis of democracy. After the 60s, there was tremendous fear in elite circles, liberal elite, internationalist circles, that there was just too much democracy, and something had to be done to beat it back. And there are publications, quite interesting ones, with liberal internationalist elites from France, the United States, Japan, and so on, in which they give recommendations. This is the early 70s. And one of the things they were concerned about in all three of the core industrial areas was that students, young people, were not being indoctrinated properly. They called, that's their term, not mine. They had to strengthen the institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young. The schools, the universities, the churches, and so on. They weren't doing their job. And you could see it in the 60s with students thinking for themselves and acting independently. It's threatening. So how do you reinstitute indoctrination and discipline? Well, a lot of methods were picked, but one of them in the United States was very simple: raise tuitions. So if you want to go to college in the United States, you're going to come out unless you have rich parents. You're going to come out with a huge debt. Well, that has a very strong disciplinary effect. I mean, maybe you went into college thinking, I'm going to be a public interest lawyer. But when you come out with $100,000 in debt, you're going to have to go to work for a corporate law firm. And once you go, you pretty soon get caught up inside the culture, and your views change and your attitudes change, and that's what you like. And also exactly what you described. The attitude of you have to look out for yourself and make sure we can support ourselves. We can't spend any time and effort worrying about others. That's driven home by the ideological system in pretty remarkable ways. I don't know how well known Ayn Rand is here. Known? Sort of. Well, this is the most lunatic collection of beliefs and ideas that you can imagine. Alan Greenspan was a representative. The only interest people should have is self-interest. Altruism is a pathology, a disease. You never do anything for anyone else. Just be as strong as you can and as rich and powerful as you can. It's counter to all human nature and emotions, but you can drive it into people's heads. In the schools in the United States, there's a foundation, a rich foundation, that funds the distribution of those ideas. They provide courses for the public schools, even in places like Massachusetts, liberal state. I found out when my grandson was taking courses in this stuff, in which the foundation gives the school a curriculum free. And it's tempting for the school. The teachers don't have to think. The supervisor can watch baseball games. They get the whole curriculum, essay questions, on how to be rich and disregard others and so on. And it's hard to measure. It surely has some kind of an effect. That's what children get indoctrinated into. So that's the way you improve the indoctrination of the institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young. And there are other measures which do impose uncertainty and fear, like debt. Actually, that's a disciplinary effect for the whole society. People are deeply in debt because there was no other way of maintaining the kind of lifestyle that's imposed on people by television advertising when your wages are going down. So these are all means for controlling people, and you find it among students. Nevertheless, despite all of that, there is quite a wide range of activism. It's very atomized. Group of people work on gay rights, another on environmental issues, another on something else. Very little involved in working with poor people if it's kind of charity, but not organizing the working people. But there's a lot there. Not just in the United States. I've seen it in other countries too. For example, I was in Mexico not long ago with my daughter, and we were walking around one of the main squares, and a lot of people walking around, and there was a little demonstration going on, and some young kids came over and asked us if we wanted to join the demonstration. We asked what it's about. It's about repression of gays in Lithuania. It's okay, but is that the main problem facing Mexico? Not exactly. But that's the kind of thing that people organize about. And it's not that that's bad, but it's what's missing that's important. And what should intellectuals do? Well, they should be helping to overcome this. They can do things.
Yes, Professor Chomsky. Yes. Yes, I'm here. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you for coming to Old Europe to talk to us. And thank you also for saying that you noted some progress at MIT over the past 50 years or so on the front of gender parity and of minorities, etc. And if you will allow me a side remark here, in this very institution at the Collège de France, we're making very slow progress on those fronts, you see. Since out of 52 chairs, only 3 are occupied by women, So, but we are hoping for some change on that front. More seriously, this conference today is centered on references to Bertrand Russell, George Orwell, and yourself. And I noted at the end of your presentation that you made a very interesting reference to John Dewey. Do you think that John Dewey is still a resource to, let's say, conceive of democracy? Is it a possible resource to think of an alternative way of conceiving of democracy?
Dewey is an interesting case. I mean, he was, the leading social philosopher in the country. He was not considered radical at all. He was right in the mainstream, straight out of mainstream America. But his positions are so radical that when you quote them now, people think they're coming from outer space. I quoted some collection of them. Now, they're actually in the American tradition. So if you go back, as I said, you go back to the 19th century, things like that were slogans of the Republican Party. I mean, it's taken a lot of effort to drive these ideas out of people's minds. And Dewey was picking up a tradition that has a lot of resonance still in the country. These same people who could be the brown shirts of a new Nazi movement could listen to Dewey and say, yeah, that's right. We ought to own everything. Workers ought to take over management. We shouldn't listen to bosses. Wage labor is an attack on our dignity and our rights. It's like slavery. Those ideas still resonate, but they're not heard. So what I was quoting, almost nobody would know, except people who read scholarly literature or something. And his ideas about education too. I mean, his main work was on education, and he was an Enlightenment figure. He accepted early Enlightenment ideas on what an educational system should be. It should not be, the imagery was that education shouldn't be like pouring water into a vessel. It should be like laying out a thread along which the child explores in its own way. Education should cultivate creativity and innovation, challenging. And so those are, I happen to be quoting Wilhelm von Humboldt, but it was common. Adam Smith said similar things. So if you look at, take Adam Smith, everyone has read the first paragraph of Wealth of Nations, in which he talks about how wonderful division of labor is. The butcher does this and so on. If you go in at 400 pages, you find that he denounces division of labor because it's going to turn people into creatures as stupid and ignorant as a human being can be. And in any civilized society, the government's going to have to step in to overcome it by education, by changing working conditions and so on. You don't read that part. In fact, if you look at the scholarly edition of Wealth of Nations put out by the University of Chicago on the bicentennial, there isn't even an index entry for that discussion of division of labor. But that was his view, and it was coming straight out of the Enlightenment, the same set of beliefs about inquiring and creating and individuality and so on being the core of the human essence. And classical liberalism comes out of the same background. Well, it's there. It's not far below the surface, I don't think, in consciousness, but it has to be evoked. And that's one of the things that intellectuals can do, help evoke it, make sure, bring it to the fore. I don't think it's too far below the surface. And it could be very concrete. So let me give you a concrete example. Right now, as you know, I'm sure, the main thrust of social and economic program policy is to empower the financial institutions and to hollow out production. Now, that doesn't mean production's not going on, but it's much more profitable for, say, Hewlett-Packard or Dell Computers to have the assembly plants in China, not in the United States. So China is becoming a huge assembly plant for the more advanced industrial societies. Very cheap labor, as you've been reading in the newspapers, suicides in the plants, miserable working conditions. So that's great for profits. Of course, it's very harmful to the domestic society. So Obama, who is following the same policies, the government pretty much owns the auto industry now, most of it, because of the bailouts. And what they're doing is closing down plants. Now, you close down an auto plant, first of all, the workers are out of a job, and the community is destroyed. I mean, these communities developed out of the industrial plants, and they're destroyed. So it's really very harmful. At the same time that Obama is closing down auto plants, he's sending his Secretary of Transportation to Spain and to France to get contracts to build high-speed rail for the United States. The United States is very backward in railroad technology. That's part of the reflection of the power of the business community. For them, it was much more important to shift the economy to very high use of fossil fuels back in the 50s and the 60s. And there were big state social engineering projects to do this. So the trains are a total wreck. And they eliminated very efficient electric railway systems and so on. Well, now they have to rebuild it. But instead of having this equipment built in a General Motors plant in Michigan, they want it to be built in Spain, which is better for the bankers and the owners, terrible for the workforce. And this is just surreal. If working people knew about this, they'd probably revolt. And what they might do is just take over the factory and build them for themselves and kick out the management and kick out the government. It's a step, but it's not a huge step. And if there was enough of the right kind of activism, I think that step could be taken. Kind of like what Jean Bricmont said about the 30s. That's what began to happen then. And that's when the major social democratic measures were instituted. Could go beyond that. But, it needs a kind of a spark. I mean, the ideas that are kind of latent in people's minds can stay there. And they can also be distorted into very harmful directions. Actually, that's what happened in the late Weimar years.
Yes, I've been teaching the neoclassical economists here just next door at La Sorbonne too. And this is the question on behalf of my students. My students, they've been asking me always the same question as we moved to John Maynfield Keynes. And it's an anti-Keynesian department. I don't even know how I got a job there. Anyways, my question on behalf of my students would be, in your opinion, to what extent should the state protect the economy of the state and private enterprise in nowadays, today?
What I need is to have the translator translate into English for me. Did somebody hear? Could you hear? Could you hear, Serge?
To what extent should the state protect the economy of the state? Today, nowadays.
Sorry, could you tell me what?
To what extent?
Yeah.
To what extent should the state?
Should the state intervene? Personally, I don't think the state ought to intervene in the economy at all. I think the public ought to intervene. So that, the core of traditional socialist thought, including Marxist thought, is that workers should take over production, not that the state should. Okay, well, and I think that's basically the right idea. What I was quoting from Dewey and so on, yeah, that's the right idea. But we don't live in that world, so maybe the public should intervene through this government, which is the one part of the power system that is at least partially responsive to the public. Private power is not at all responsive. Well, then it isn't a question of whether the state should intervene, but how it should intervene. I mean, the way it is intervening radically. In fact, the whole high-tech economy comes from government intervention. Here too, the things I mentioned. But that's government intervention on the principle that the public pays the costs and takes the risks, and then it gets privatized for profit. Well, that's one form of intervention. Another form of intervention is to introduce social democratic measures. as has been done. Improving life. Some people were talking about Orwell's attitude toward this. I agree with it. I don't think the state should intervene, but if they intervene to make life better for people, okay, fine, don't object to that. But it's not a question of how much, really. It's a question of what should the policies be. That's true right now. I mean, in Europe, for example, the state authorities are intervening, say in Greece or in Spain. It's coming along. It'll be here too. With policies that enrich the bankers and harm the population. Okay, that's a form of intervention. There are other forms of intervention. And even better would be to have the population become directly participants in controlling institutions.
Peut-être une dernière question.
Perhaps one last question.
Professor Chomsky a déjà beaucoup parlé. Comme vous le savez, il a
Professor Chomsky has already talked a lot, and he has a very, very busy timetable over the next few hours.
So, thank you very much, Professor Chomsky. I have two questions, one related to the future and one to the past. I agree very much with your, I would call it, extended conception of democracy, which should include also mastering the conditions of work. So we have historical examples of transfer of means of production. It was in a revolutionary way. Do you still think it is a viable way today? And if not, what alternatives way can we imagine? And I have also another question which is related to the past. It's related to also a historical example of what was called self-management socialism in former Yugoslavia. So I came from Belgrade to listen to your lectures. Forgive me for this question. So what is your opinion on that model, alternative model of social organization in former Yugoslavia? At the time...
You meant market socialism, did you say?
No. I mean self-management socialism in former Yugoslavia, what was called self-management. And what...
Self-management. Oh, Yugoslavia, I see. Yeah.
And does that fact that Yugoslavia was example of alternative socialism has played a role in destruction of Yugoslavia, in your opinion? That very fact of alternative model of social organization has played any role in destruction of Yugoslavia? Thank you very much.
Well, the self-management in Yugoslavia was an interesting and a progressive move. I think it had some successes. It had a barrier, namely it was within the framework of a totalitarian state, a powerful totalitarian state, which allowed a certain degree of independence and freedom, but imposed quite heavy structures on independence and freedom of thought and freedom of action. So it limited what could be done. But I think it is the right idea. And that is traditional Marxism. I mean, that's why left Marxists were so critical of Lenin, because Lenin destroyed all that. I mean, it's kind of surprising to me that, say, in France, anti-Bolshevism developed in the mid-'70s. Should have developed in 1920, I mean, Lenin and Trotsky too, their immediate steps were to destroy the instruments of workers' production, the Soviets and the factory councils. They were kind of neutralized very quickly by the Bolshevik leadership. I mean, they had their own reasons, principled reasons. They were sort of a certain variety of orthodox Marxists who believed that you couldn't have a socialist revolution in a backward peasant society like Russia. So therefore the population had to be driven by force through industrialization, and then the iron laws of history come along and so on. And it was all turned into a monstrosity by Stalin, but the basic structure was right there. So, and that's why they were condemned by the left Marxists and, of course, the anarchists, almost all of them, and by Bertrand Russell. Like Russell was there, I think, 1920, immediately criticized it on these grounds. He was a traditional socialist, work should be worker self-management. But is that feasible today? I don't see why not. I mean, bits and pieces of it are being developed. Not on a huge scale, but in the United States, for example, there are probably by now a couple of thousand small cases of self-managed small industries and community marketing systems and so on. And that could expand, and it could expand very fast. I don't see why it's not a viable system. In fact, there's no, say corporations. I mean, if you take a look at corporate law, this has been pointed out by economists, in fact. You take a look at corporate law, or the corporate structure, it's a decision, not a sort of a requirement that corporate management be responsive to shareholders. Why not be responsive to the interests of what are called stakeholders? That means the workers and the community. You could just as well, that's just as possible. And if you take a look at some of the structures in Europe, like co-determination, it has bits of kind of a small element of that. Well, there's no reason why that can't grow either. And it can be a perfectly, as far as anyone knows, perfectly efficient as well as much more democratic form of organization of the economy. It would also cut away at the political power of unaccountable private capital. They have enormous political power. In fact, in the United States, they essentially buy the elections. Okay, it can cut away at that too. But I don't see any principled objection to going back to these traditional socialist concepts. It's true that they've been suppressed for, ever since the Bolshevik Revolution. I mean, after the Bolshevik Revolution, the two major power centers in the world, the huge one run in the West and the weaker one in the East, they disagreed on a lot of things, but they agreed on one thing, namely that what was being created in the Soviet Union was socialism. They both agreed on that. The West liked it because it defamed socialism. And the Bolsheviks liked it because they had some appeal from the moral, some support from the moral appeal of socialism. Well, when the world's two propaganda systems, a huge one and a small one, agree on something, it's pretty hard for people to separate themselves from it. And that's had a really devastating effect ever since 1918, Okay, we got to dismantle all that stuff.
Connaissance, recherche, sciences, mathématiques, théorie, physique, philosophie, conférences, archéologie, nature.
La parole est maintenant au professeur Noam Chomsky.
And now yield the floor to Professor Noam
Chomsky,
who chose the title Power Hunger Tempered by Deception, a very Orwellian, by self-deception, a very, it's actually a quote from George Orwell on its notes on nationalism. Now yield the floor to him with great pleasure.
The past generation has witnessed an enlightening experiment that bears directly on the general topics of this conference and also on the specific aspects that I've been asked to address, the ones indicated in the title, Power, Hunger Tempered by Self-Deception. There have, of course, been assaults in the intellectual world on the very concepts of rationality and truth and on the values of democracy. This was discussed this morning. I don't frankly find them impressive, to put it mildly, and they're not what concern me here. Rather, I have in mind an experiment in large-scale social engineering that was organized in the most advanced industrial democracies and imposed on the world in the name of rationality and truth, the programs of social and economic management that are often called economic rationality, some other names like neoliberalism or the Washington Consensus or market fundamentalism and others. There are variants, but they adhere closely to two basic doctrines, which are called the efficient markets hypothesis and the theory of rational expectations. There have been critics, but it's fair to say that these became virtual orthodoxy within the professions after the breakdown of the post-World War II Bretton Woods systems in the 1970s. Within policy-making circles and the political class, they're identified rather dubiously with Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. As I said, there are critics, rare, but they're there. One distinguished critic is Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz. Even before he became chief economist of the World Bank, he ridiculed what he called the religion that markets know best. And his primary professional work, for which he won the Nobel Prize, concludes that even slight changes in accessibility to information show, I'll quote him, show that unfettered markets are not efficient and can be characterized by persistent unemployment, contrary to the orthodoxy. There's now, by now, substantial empirical evidence to support the conclusion many years ago by international economist David Felix that the capstone of the neoliberal strategy, namely, I'm quoting him, liberalizing and globalizing capital markets, has not accelerated economic growth in the developing countries by more efficiently guiding their capital accumulation and technological progress, which is what the theory was supposed to show. And moreover, he wrote some years ago that these strategies have been associated with slower and more unstable growth, and the failure is likely to persist because the theoretical basis, the neoliberal case for capital market liberalization, has an extremely weak basis in economic theory, and growing awareness of this is undermining confidence in its policies at the International Monetary Fund and other promoters of capital market liberalization. I stress that these observations were rare, and they were well before the market crash of 2008. And with that crash, an interesting event in intellectual history, the almost complete collapse of the doctrinal orthodoxy that had prevailed and had been so utterly blinding that virtually no professional economists or the Federal Reserve, the central bank in the United States, none of them took notice of a housing bubble that reached $8 trillion before it burst. The power of the efficient market hypothesis was so strong that although they could see the arithmetic, virtually nobody could notice what was happening. There had been critical analysis by a few economists who had been ignored. Maybe the most important of them is Hyman Minsky. And they've moved a little bit closer to center stage as the orthodoxy collapsed in such a spectacular fashion, though not before leading to a financial crisis that barely escaped depression and that remains deeply threatening even to the very existence of the Eurozone, with many possible consequences beyond. The primary victims of the economic rationality experiment are the usual ones, the poorer societies, although a more accurate description would be that the primary victims have been poor and working people everywhere, while privileged sectors everywhere have fared quite well, including the pockets of extreme privilege in the poorer societies. There have been significant exceptions to the generally harmful effects of the experiment, namely the states that ignored the rules, mainly in East Asia. These states adopted the actual practices of the developed societies and dismissed the demands of the developed societies. That happens to be in accord with important historical antecedents to which I'll return briefly. There are a number of reasons why the iconic figures of the orthodoxy, Reagan and Thatcher, are dubious choices. I'll keep to Reagan the more important case because of U.S. global dominance. Now, I'm speaking here of the real Reagan, not the imaginary figure who has been constructed by the public relations industry. Polls right through Reagan's terms in office, revealed that he was not a particularly popular president, contrary to myth. His approval ratings were well within the norm. But after leaving office, he was raised to mythical status by a stunning propaganda campaign organized and implemented by the very powerful business sector, which had good reasons to elevate him to sainthood. I'll read from a publication of the prestigious Hoover Institution at Stanford University. They write that Reagan was a colossal figure whose spirit seems to stride the country, watching us like a warm and friendly ghost. And other accolades across the spectrum, all the way to Obama, are often not very different. Reagan is extolled as the apostle of small government, fiscal responsibility, free trade, and other core principles of economic rationality. And as in the case of other religious cults, facts are irrelevant. It's, for example, irrelevant that under his term in office, the government grew relative to gross domestic product. And it's irrelevant that his fiscal irresponsibility quickly turned the United States from the world's leading creditor nation to the world's leading debtor nation. And it left a legacy of financial wreckage, which began with the savings and loan crisis that required a huge government bailout, And it's irrelevant that he was by far the most protectionist president in post-war history. He doubled protective barriers and undertook various other forms of state intervention to rescue incompetent U.S. management from more efficient Japanese production. I'll put aside here the ghastly crimes of his terms and years in office that included not only large-scale slaughter and destruction over much of the world, but also a substantial contribution to nuclear proliferation, which we live with today, and as an extra benefit, a contribution to jihadi terror. I don't want to suggest that Reagan departed radically from the norm in his actual practices, which had very little resemblance to the imagery created by his worshippers. Long before Reagan, much of the high-tech economy derived from the dynamic state sector that includes computers, the internet, the rest of the information technology revolution, includes the commercial aircraft industry, and with it, of course, the huge tourism industry, includes the basic technology of international trade, and a great deal more. A core theme of modern economic development is that the public pays the costs and takes the risks while eventual profits are privatized. The salience of this theme is not very surprising when we consider who are the designers of social and economic policies. That's exactly what we'd expect them to design. And there are many devices to achieve these ends. Among them are government-funded research and development, protectionism, government procurement, a major technique of subsidy, repeated bailouts, all pursued intensively during the Reagan years, but in fact throughout the post-war period, and with a long history in all the developed societies, reaching from England, the first one, up to the East Asian tigers today. The actual history is quite helpful in understanding and evaluating the recent religious experiment with economic rationality. Actually, today's dominant global power is a good illustration. The United States gained its sovereignty during what's called the Revolutionary War, and immediately after gaining its sovereignty, the United States became the mother country and bastion of protectionism. Those are the words of the distinguished economic historian Paul Baruch, and it also had the highest growth rate, becoming by far the world's most powerful economy a century ago. And very high protection was only one of the devices of state intervention in the economy. There are many others which aren't studied by economic historians, but they're there. So consider cotton, which was the fuel of the early industrial revolution, like oil today. The U.S. did achieve dominance of cotton production, namely by extermination of the indigenous population, territorial expansion, and slavery, which are rather severe forms of market interference. One of the motives for the annexation of Texas and the conquest of half of Mexico was to gain a monopoly of cotton production. And the reasons were quite explicit. I'll quote President Tyler, who was one of those involved. He says, conquering these territories and gaining a monopoly of cotton production places all other nations at our feet. An embargo of a single year would produce in Europe a greater amount of suffering than a 50 years war. I doubt whether Great Britain could avoid convulsions. Notice that these are the claims attributed to Saddam Hussein, ridiculously, but they're the actual practice of the United States, which was making those claims. The idea was that in this way, by bringing Britain to our feet, the U.S. would be able to overcome the superior military power of its great enemy, Britain, which at that time was a deterrent to intended expansion. So the U.S. repeatedly tried to conquer Canada, but was always beaten back. The basic programs of economic development were established right after the Revolution by Alexander Hamilton. He was the pioneer of import substitution industrialization. That's a very serious error according to economic doctrine then and now. But in the real world, it's a regular foundation for development in actual history. Hamilton chose to violate the injunctions of the greatest economists of the day, who urged that Americans should adhere to the principles of economic rationality. The Americans should import superior British manufactures, and they should concentrate on their comparative advantage in export of primary products. Adam Smith warned, I'll quote him, that were the Americans, either by combination or any other sort of violence, to stop the importation of European manufactures, and by thus giving a monopoly to such of their own countrymen as could manufacture the goods, divert any considerable part of their capital into this employment, they would retard instead of accelerating the further increase in the value of their annual produce, and they would obstruct instead of promoting the progress of their country towards real wealth and greatness. This would be still more the case were they to attempt in some manner to monopolize to themselves their whole exportation of trade, as they indeed did with regard to cotton. This surely counts as one of the most spectacularly refuted predictions in economic history, even more than the predictions of the last 10 years, 10, 15 years, but it was solidly based on the abstract theories that were imposed on the colonies at the time and that are imposed on the weak today. It's exactly the same policies with exactly the same consequences. It led to the third world and under the imperial control. It has led to the devastation of the weak countries under modern economic rationality. And the countries that rejected it, like the United States from the beginning, and the Asian tigers today, and in fact England during its period of development, the countries that rejected it grew and developed. But in a religious faith, facts are irrelevant. It doesn't matter how overwhelming they are. Going back to Bayreuth, he goes so far as to argue that protectionism, rather paradoxically, has commonly increased trade. The reason he gives is that protectionism tends to stimulate growth, and growth leads to trade, while imposed liberalization since the 18th century under imperialism, it has generally had harmful economic effects. In fact, it essentially led to what we call the third world. Bayreuth concludes that it is difficult to find another case where the facts so contradict the dominant theory as the theory concerning the negative impact of protectionism. And as I mentioned, protectionism is only one of the modes of violation of economic orthodoxy, recently enshrined as economic rationality, neoliberalism. Well, I don't mean to suggest that the case is closed. Far too little is understood about economic growth to draw any confident conclusions, even though the evidence is quite overwhelming in this case, and by the standards of economics or the social sciences, remarkably strong. The founder of economic growth, the modern theory of economic growth, Nobel laureate Robert Solow, he commented recently that despite the enormous accumulation of data since his pioneering work over half a century ago, the direction of causality, he says, is unknown. So it's not clear whether capital investment causes productivity or productivity leads to capital investment. It's not known whether openness to trade improves economic growth or whether growth leads to trade. and the same problems arise in other dimensions. In the light of the very partial theoretical understanding and what we know of the historical record, it's quite illuminating to observe the supreme confidence with which the core principles of economic rationality were upheld until their recent spectacular collapse. And it's also illuminating to see the continued reverence for figures who radically violated them at every turn, Ronald Reagan perhaps being the most striking example. Actually, Adam Smith is a more interesting example. He's by no means the absurd figure of the religious faith that has been constructed around his image. That includes professional economics. So consider, for example, the famous phrase, invisible hand, which is constantly invoked in justification of neoliberal doctrine. In his classic book, Wealth of Nations, the phrase appears once, namely in discussing the hazards of what is now called neoliberalism. Smith's primary concern, of course, was England. And he warned that if English merchants and manufacturers were free to import, export, and invest abroad, they would profit while English society would be harmed. But that's unlikely to happen, he argued. And the reason is that English capitalists and merchants would prefer to invest and purchase in the home country, so as if by an invisible hand, England would be spared the ravages of economic liberalism. That's the one use of the phrase. The leading founder of another leading founder of classical economics, David Ricardo, he drew similar conclusions. He used his famous example of English textiles and Portuguese wines, and he concluded that his theory of comparative advantage would collapse if English capitalists chose to invest in Portugal for both manufacturing and agriculture. But he argued that, I'll quote him, thanks to the natural disinclination which every man has to quit the country of his birth and connections, and fancied or real insecurity of capital abroad, most men of property would be satisfied with the low rate of profits in their own country, rather than seek a more advantageous employment for their wealth in foreign nations. Feelings, he said, that I would be sorry to see weakened. So it's a kind of a sentimental argument that maybe economic rationality won't be too terrible. Well, we don't have to tarry on the force of the arguments of the great classical economists, but their instincts were insightful and very different from what's propounded in their names. And these are, incidentally, far from the only examples. There are other interesting ones. The doctrines of economic rationalism that dominated mainstream discourse in the advanced societies for a generation have shaped policy, although selectively. One recipe for the weak, a sharply different one for the powerful, much as in the past. And it seems fair to conclude that their dominance does not reflect either rationality or commitment to truth, but rather the usual service to power and privilege. And the consequences are unmistakable. So take, say, the United States. During these years, the financial institutions that were the main beneficiaries of the doctrines, as well as their most fervent advocates, they have vastly expanded their power. They now have about a third of corporate profits, far higher than before the experiment. And that's had a comparable impact on political life. Elections are pretty much bought, and they set those who buy them set the basic framework for policy. Meanwhile, for the majority of the population, real wages have stagnated, and family incomes have been sustained only by higher working hours, by now the highest in the industrial world, by debt, and by asset inflation, like the housing bubble. And, of course, there's regular collapse of the bubbles every few years. Well, the United States is very rich by comparative standards, but it's taking on some of the structural characteristics of the former colonies. Typically, they have sectors of enormous wealth and privilege amidst a sea of misery and suffering. And while the United States is richer, so it's not massive suffering, that's pretty much the structural nature of the society. Probably has now the highest inequality in its history. Consequence of the two ways of imposing economic rationality, one way for the rich, another way for the poor. Well, let me go back to the title of these remarks. Can we say that the consequences are the outcome of power hunger and self-deception? Or to use the terms that are current today, can we blame greedy bankers who are guilty of irrational exuberance? That's the famous phrase of the most lauded economist of the past generation, Alan Greenspan, at least lauded before the crash. That was a phrase of his in a rare moment of departure from orthodoxy. Well, that criticism doesn't seem fair to me. When bankers are greedy, they're pursuing their institutional commitment. That's what they're supposed to be. Their role is to maximize profits. And in Anglo-American corporate law, that's actually a legal responsibility. So you can't blame them for fulfilling their legal responsibility in an institutional structure that demands that behavior. If some of them were to reject this commitment and not be greedy bankers, they'd be removed, and others would take their place. Power hunger is an institutional feature of a competitive system. Furthermore, the exuberance of the necessarily greedy bankers was by no means irrational, contrary to Greenspan. The bigger banks knew that they were taking no serious risk with transactions that were very profitable but might well fail. And the reason is they could rely upon an implicit government insurance policy. It's called too big to fail. So if you get into trouble, the taxpayer will bail you out. The very existence of this insurance policy gives them substantial benefits as compared to rivals. It means they can take risks, make profits, get credit on cheap terms, and so on. And they regularly cash in when it's necessary. So under Reagan, the spirit that hovers over us, one of the larger banks, Continental Illinois, was rescued by a taxpayer bailout. Also under Reagan, the predecessor of the huge firm Citigroup, was then called Citibank, it was rescued from disaster by the International Monetary Fund. The fund is the credit community's enforcer. It was described by its U.S. executive director quite accurately. Make sure that creditors are paid off, no matter who suffers. And it's returning to its traditional role today. They can tell you about it in Greece and Spain, soon elsewhere. Probably the most respected economic correspondent in the Western world today, Martin Wolf of the Financial Times, London Financial Times, he says that the current bailout is overtly a rescue of Greece, but covertly a bailout of banks. That's exactly right. In a capitalist system, if someone makes a bad loan, it's their problem. But in our system, which is radically anti-capitalist, if a big firm makes a bad loan, it's a problem for those who didn't borrow the money, like the poor people in the country that's targeted, and the other people, and the citizens of the rich country who have to pay off the lender through the International Monetary Fund. I mean, it's as if, say, I were to lend you money, and I know it's risky, so I get high interest, and then at some point you can't pay anymore, and I insist that your neighbors pay me, and my neighbors pay me. That's the International Monetary Fund. It's radically anti-capitalist, but it serves the masters, so it works. Pretty much the same has been true during the current financial crisis in the United States. The big banks were not only rescued by taxpayers, they're the ones who caused the crisis, but they were not only rescued, but they ended up more profitable and larger than before, and in a position to prepare for the next and probably worse crisis. But the bankers can hardly be faulted for doing what they should do under the rules of the game. Criticism of them is simply unfair. Well, after the current financial crisis erupted, consensus developed among professional economists that it's foolhardy to disregard what's called systemic risk. That is, the threat to the whole system if some transaction fails. But that's hardly a new insight. It's an elementary feature of markets that transactions ignore what are called externalities, that is, effects on others. So if I sell you a car, you and I pay attention to the cost and gain to ourselves, but we don't pay attention to the cost to others, which can be quite real, in fact. And the same is true on a massive scale in financial institutions. Well, for financial transactions, that means that they must ignore systemic risk. That's part of the nature of a market system. It's long been understood that that practice is hazardous, and there have been occasional warnings in the profession. It's pretty elementary, nothing profound about this. The market inefficiency alone makes financial crash a highly likely contingency, and the risk is amplified by the perverse incentives that follow from the political power of private capital. Among them, the too big to fail at government insurance policy, but there are many others as well. Now, one can plausibly argue that the institutional structure is irrational, but those who are fulfilling their roles within it may be quite rational when they choose to bring down the temple walls while escaping themselves and even profiting, as in the current financial crisis. I should say that there are much broader cases of this. So corporate managers in the United States are producing a huge amount of propaganda to convince the population that global warming is a liberal hoax. And in fact, they've been so successful that by now barely a third of the population thinks that humans contribute to global warming. Well, the CEOs, the managers who are carrying out this campaign, know perfectly well that it's very serious, and it's going to be very harmful to their grandchildren and to what they own. But the fate of the species is an externality. They cannot pay attention to it and still function in their institutional role, which is to make short-term profit. So therefore, if the species is destroyed, that's kind of unfortunate, but that's an externality, the kind of thing you're taught to put in a footnote when you study an economics course. And it's the way the system works. Well, there may be elements of self-deception in this. There's always a strong temptation to disguise antisocial and criminal acts in an aura of benevolence and noble intent. The merest look at the foreign policy literature of powerful states yields a torrent of illustrations. But the charge of irrationality is very questionable. It's unfair. Well, turning from rationality to truth, we might recall an observation of Orwell in his essay on what he called literary censorship in England. He suggests in this essay that the British should not feel too self-righteous in condemning the vulgar means of control of expression in the totalitarian Soviet Union. So in Free England, Orwell wrote, "Unpopular ideas can be silenced and inconvenient facts kept dark without any need for an official ban. And anyone who challenges the prevailing orthodoxy finds himself silenced with surprising effectiveness." He goes on to say that the process is voluntary. It's a general tacit agreement that it wouldn't do to mention that particular fact. That's the product of a good education. And it's reinforced by centralization of the press in the hands of wealthy men who have every motive to be dishonest on certain important topics. That's Orwell on England. And perhaps illustrating his thesis, the essay is not too well known. It was intended as the introduction to Animal Farm, his famous book, but it didn't appear. And it was discovered many years later in his unpublished papers. The message of his unpublished essay is quite simple. Truth may be useful in some circumstances. For example, demanding truth in the Soviet Union. That's useful. But it's not a value to be cherished highly by the privileged, so we don't want it in our own domains. Well, let me turn to the third concept in the framework for this conference, democracy. The current financial crisis also offers interesting lessons, some quite straightforward. So it's hard to overlook the fact that as the financial institutions took over more of the economy since the 1970s, extensively in fact, they also gained political power, sufficiently so as to dismantle the regulatory apparatus that had been established during the Great Depression and had successfully prevented financial crises. There weren't any from the Depression up until the neoliberal period of the 70s. More generally, the financial liberalization helped institute what some international economists have called a virtual senate of investors and lenders, I'm quoting, who conduct moment-by-moment referendums on government policies. So if the virtual senate determines that the policies of some government are irrational, meaning that they're designed to help people, not increase profit, then they can exercise their veto power by capital flight, by a tax on currency, and other means. Actually, France went through this experience under Mitterrand. To take a more recent example, which is quite enlightening, after Hugo Chavez was inaugurated, capital flight from Venezuela escalated to the point where capital held abroad by wealthy Venezuelans equaled 1/5 of Venezuela's gross domestic product. It's quoting OECD economist Javier Santiso. He adds that after the U.S.-backed military coup in 2002 that overthrew the elected government, the response of the markets approached euphoria and capital started pouring back in, but then returned again a few days later, flowing out when the government was restored by popular protests. The virtual Senate was giving their judgment. And in general, with capital flow liberalized, which is what happened in the 1970s, governments face what's sometimes called a dual constituency. One constituency is voters, and the other constituency is the virtual Senate. And even in the rich countries, the private constituency tends to prevail, which means that financial liberalization serves as an effective curb on democracy. Maybe it's a coincidence, maybe not, but it's worth noticing that financial liberalization was introduced in the 1970s alongside of growing concern of elites over what they called the crisis of democracy in the 1960s, too much democracy. That's when normally passive and obedient sectors of the population, who are called the special interests, began to enter the political arena to put forward their concerns. And this excessive democracy, as it was called, was too much of an overload for the state, which could not attend properly to what's called the national interest. Now, the special interests are women, workers, farmers, the young, the elderly, minorities, majorities. In fact, the general population, they're the special interests. The national interest is defined by those who own and run the society. Actually, I'm paraphrasing closely the liberal internationalist sector of elite opinion. Those who, for example, staffed the Carter administration in the United States and their counterparts in Europe and Japan, liberal internationalists. You move further to the right or the business world, and the need to overcome the crisis of democracy was a still more pressing concern. and the rhetoric is much harsher. And many measures have since been employed to purge society of the evil of democracy. That goes on right to the present. Financial liberalization made a potent contribution to this, whether by design or not. Well, under powerful public pressure, these measures for undermining democracy were restricted under the Bretton Woods system that was established by the US and Britain after World War II. What had happened is that the Great Depression and the war had aroused radical democratic currents, which took many forms, from the anti-fascist resistance to working class organization. And these pressures made it possible, or from a different point of view, necessary, to permit social democratic policies in the industrial countries. The Bretton Woods system of regulated currencies and capital controls created space for government action to responding to the public will, that is, some measure of democracy. One of the designers of the system, John Maynard Keynes, he considered the most important achievement of Bretton Woods to be the establishment of the right of governments to restrict capital movement. In dramatic contrast, in the neoliberal period that followed the collapse of Bretton Woods, the U.S. Treasury Department now regards free capital mobility as a fundamental right, unlike the socioeconomic and cultural rights in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which are meaning health, right to health, education, decent employment, security. These are dismissed by the U.S. government as preposterous, mere myths, unlike free capital movement. Well, in earlier years, the public hadn't been much of a problem. The reasons are reviewed in the standard scholarly history of the international monetary system by economist Barry Eichengreen. He observes that in the 19th century, governments, I'm quoting him, governments had not yet been politicized by universal male suffrage and the rise of trade unionisms and parliamentary labor parties. Therefore, the severe costs imposed by the virtual Senate of lenders and investors could be transferred to the general population. But with the radicalization of the general public during the Great Depression and the anti-fascist war, that luxury was no longer available to private power and wealth. And therefore, in the Bretton Woods system, limits on capital mobility substituted for limits on democracy as a source of insulation from market pressures. It's only necessary to add the obvious corollary. With the dismantling of the system during the great social experiment since the 1970s, financialization of the economy, functioning democracy is restricted, quite severely, in fact. Well, there are numerous examples of how deception, and among the more naive, self-deception, are used to overcome the barriers to right thinking that are posed by the stupidity of the average man. I'm borrowing that phrase from President Obama's favorite philosopher and a revered figure among intellectuals, Reinhold Niebuhr, who was restating with approval the familiar elite conception that intelligent minorities must rule unhindered by interference by the public, who must be pacified by necessary illusion and emotionally potent oversimplifications. It's Niebuhr's advice. One illustration of deception, which I already mentioned, is the post-war decision to devote substantial public resources to creating the modern high-tech economy. Maybe it was the right decision, maybe not, but the political class was never willing to take a chance to let the public decide on how public funds might be dispersed. So the project was therefore concealed in the Pentagon budget, and it was sold to the public by the Niebuhrian techniques necessary to defend ourselves from the rampaging hordes of Russia and China and other evil forces that are regularly conjured up to justify forceful intervention. Some went to extreme lengths to concoct such illusions. One of them was the warm and friendly ghost who watches over us benignly. He actually declared a national emergency in the United States in 1985 because of the threat to our survival posed by the government of Nicaragua, whose troops were only 2 days away from Texas, poised to overwhelm us. Well, in Reagan's case, it was probably self-deception. He probably didn't know what was going on. But there are more rational figures like Dean Acheson, leading architect of the post-war system. He advised secretly that policymakers must be clearer than truth, as he put it, to achieve their goals, which are righteous by definition. Well, these are among the many ways in which privileged sectors have been able to protect themselves from recurrent crises of excessive democracy, which erupt even in the constantly, in fact, even in the limited forms of democracy that exist in state capitalist systems like ours. But there are many who have found these limits far too severe. In the early stages of the Industrial Revolution in the United States, with almost no influence from Europe, working people took it for granted that those who work in the mills should own them, and that wage labor differs from slavery only in that it's temporary. That was a conception that was so popular that it was accepted by Abraham Lincoln, and it was a slogan of the Republican Party. It became the leading principle of the genuine socialist movements, and it was later adopted by prominent 20th century thinkers, Bertrand Russell for one. He held, his words, "There can be no real freedom or democracy until the men who do the work in a business also control its management." The leading American social philosopher, John Dewey, devoted much of his work to democracy. He observed that in a free and democratic society, workers should be the masters of their own industrial fate, not tools rented by employers. That's actually a position that traces back to the leading ideas of classical liberalism, articulated by Wilhelm von Humboldt and Adam Smith, among others. Therefore, he went on to say, industry must be changed from a feudalistic to a democratic social order based on workers' control. That's the essence of authentic socialism, not known in what's called socialism. Direct participant control, in Dewey's view, should extend to the means of production, exchange, publicity, transportation, and communication. Whoever owns them rules the life of the country. Hence, the rich and powerful, even if democratic forms remain. And until that level of democracy is achieved, politics, Dewey said, will remain the shadow cast on society by big business. Well, in the state capitalist and state socialist societies, there have been massive efforts to drive such thoughts out of popular consciousness, but they persist, not too far below the surface, and they continually spring forth, offering some hope, in my personal view at least, that humans may find a way to confound the prediction of Bertrand Russell that our brief stay on Earth is a passing nightmare, and that peace will not come until as long as the species survives, which may not be too long if current tendencies persist without a sharp change of course. Thanks.
To have so undermined the blacklist that it's almost a joke.
A joke? I know the blacklist that produced Robert Rich. I've seen its horror. cruelty, hideous waste of life as I've walked in the long line of its anonymous.
And I cannot invent one more witticism about Robert Rich or the Oscar he can't claim, because that small, worthless, golden statue is covered with the blood of my friends.